Everyone is allowed to dream.
We looked at our new home as a new chapter in our life.
We wanted to start a family. It was just perfect.
But sometimes, reality can be a nightmare.
If you aren't comfortable, it's not home.
Well, he felt he had to fight for what he felt was right.
Even the most ideal of places can become the neighborhood from hell.
We decided to protect ourselves.
The man was losing it.
You threatened my wife!
Every single person has a capacity for a violent act.
I deserve some respect!
Meadow Charm, the name says it all. This little subdivision was built just a few years ago, here in Vancouver, Washington.
When I first saw Meadow Charm, it felt like home. It was a charming little neighborhood. The neighbors are very friendly.
No, nothing.
One of the friendliest is John Kendall, a bachelor known for being very welcoming to new arrivals.
I first saw John Kendall shortly after I had moved into my home. I didn't really know him personally, but John did come over and he wanted to know if he could help me, which was a friendly gesture.
Absolutely.
John was so pleasant, so easy to get along with. He was one of the nicest neighbors I've had.
John was the very first homeowner in that subdivision. John had mentioned he'd never been married and no children. He was a solo kind of a man. He was in the Air Force years ago. John enjoyed living in the neighborhood. He loved the house. He was always out and about doing something with the property. He was definitely willing to give me a neighborly hand with anything if I needed any help.
It seems like John will be the ideal neighbor for the newest kids on our block, Eric and Abigail Mounts. They're moving in right next door to him.
We decided to leave our old home because we wanted to find a neighborhood that had a little bit more order to it. The neighborhood that we lived in, people ended up renting out their houses, and so the quality of the neighborhood went down a little bit.
This new home was in a quiet neighborhood that seemed to be in a really peaceful area. It was ideal and safe. We were really happy.
It seems Eric and Abigail's happiness has been in the cards from the moment they met.
Abigail is the love of my life. We met at the company that we both work at.
Eric's very good looking. He's also very charming. The 13 years that we've been married has been the best years of my life.
We looked at our new home as a new chapter in our life. We wanted to raise a family, and we thought that having a new home would be a perfect time. It was big enough to start a family in.
Why do I gotta carry the heavy stuff?
Hey, how you guys doing?
John Kendall came over right when they moved in and was sort of the self-appointed welcome wagon type guy.
Listen, you guys wouldn't have a crowbar I could borrow, would you?
He walked into my garage and asked to borrow a crowbar. He was just a neighbor needing help, and I helped him.
That's perfect. That'll be perfect, thank you. Thank you.
He just kind of gave the rundown of the neighborhood. So-and-so lives there, so-and-so lives there. It's a nice place.
But I just live next door.
You'd think a friendly gesture on moving day would be the beginning of a lasting friendship.
He seemed a little forward, but overall, my first impression was that he was a friendly person. I didn't think I would have any issues with John.
Cool?
But nothing could be further from the truth.
You threatened my wife! Why are you coming after me? Good luck. Nice meeting you, yeah.
It's a lot of work, but the Mounces finally get all moved in.
Interesting.
After we finished, we were very tired, but we were happy. And we were just so glad to be in our new house.
You little smoky, eh?
We were outside on the back patio making dinner on the barbecue.
It seemed like John was really irritated that we were barbecuing.
John complained about the smoke from the barbecue. He didn't complain directly. He just made a statement like, you're not smoking us out or anything, but it's okay.
Barbecuing is a really normal thing to do in the summertime, so I found it really odd that that would irritate him.
Hey, Eric, can you control that smoke?
I told John it's a barbecue. I can't help it. It's how barbecue is. He didn't really have much reaction after I said that. He just turned around and walked away.
It's the first hint of trouble on the horizon. Eric and Abigail are too exhausted to think too much about it. But their first night's sleep in Meadow Charm ends with a rude awakening from next door.
We started hearing the hammering. The noise was really loud and disruptive. We had all the windows open because it was really hot outside and we wanted to get some fresh air into the house. And John was hammering really loud.
After a while of hearing the noise, I went outside to talk to John.
Hey, John.
Hey, Eric, how you doing?
And he told me that he was building a shed for his business. He ran a vacuum cleaner repair business and he was moving it. He said that the equipment that he used inside the garage produced so much dust that it would literally cover him and it cover everything inside the garage, and he didn't like that.
Right? So I'm okay. It's just...
You allowed to do that?
The neighborhood rules stated that we were not allowed to have a commercial business on our property. One of the reasons why we purchased the place was the fact that the neighborhood had rules in which everybody was obligated to comply with.
Me all over everything in the garage.
The couple worries the dust and racket from John's business will be unbearable once he moves it into the shed.
The vacuum cleaner thing was really annoying because he would spend hours grinding and polishing and doing whatever he needed to do to rehabilitate these vacuum cleaners.
My first thought was that dust is now going to be coming in through my kitchen window and into our house. I brought up the rules of the neighborhood that if there was any additions to the house, that plans had to be submitted and then a vote amongst the homeowners would take place.
What about the neighborhood rules?
When John moved in, there were no rules. At least that's what he claims.
The neighborhood, it was a slow development. They were only building a few houses a year. So it wasn't enforced for the early years. There wasn't enough homes built yet.
I don't know what you're talking about.
And he just became agitated and said that there's no homeowners association and there are no rules. And he just kind of got grumpy and grumbled and just ignored me.
I really don't think John was worried about it. John had the attitude of, this is my home, I'll do what I want.
He started hammering even harder, like he was trying to make as much noise as possible. It was ridiculously loud.
Eric and Abigail study the regulations that are supposed to manage the behavior of Meadow Charm residents.
When the developer starts building, they establish certain rules that will govern the neighborhood. These housing rules were fairly detailed. They talked about a lot of different behaviors, and the idea is to establish a particular tone in a neighborhood.
Tragically, the tone in this neighborhood will get 100 times worse before it gets better.
To have that bad blood, I can't imagine what that's like.
John said he bought this house with the idea of renting out rooms.
I wonder if John knew what his tenants were like and if he cared or not.
You're not allowed to rent out like this.
I can do whatever I want.
I didn't know what to do. Our first impressions of the neighborhood were really great. The neighborhood was nice, it was quiet. We just thought it was odd that this noise started happening.
It's not easy settling into a new home. But it's easier for Eric and Abigail Mounts when they decide to just ignore their neighbor John Kendall's noisy construction next door.
We went back to our normal schedules, which are pretty intense. We work for a silicon wafer manufacturer. I work in the chemistry side, and Abigail works on the production side of it. I work during the days, and Abigail works during the nights.
When your life's that busy, someone's car blocking your driveway can be doubly annoying.
Do you think you're gonna be late?
I don't know.
The number of cars that ended up parking in front of John's house, it would be a large amount. And it would interfere with us backing out of our driveway. It would interfere with traffic coming down the road. It just created a nuisance.
Hey, John.
Oh, hey, Eric.
Is that gray car out there yours?
I don't know. Let me check. Anybody here own a great car?
He was renting his house out to a number of tenants.
Yeah, it's one of my guys.
John elaborated on how he had converted part of his garage into a livable space and how he had converted other areas inside his house into actual rooms that he could rent out to tenants.
How many people do you have living here?
John was renting out at least 5 rooms to 5 different tenants each month, and he was bringing in close to $3,000 a month in rental income.
His house was more like an apartment complex, a multifamily home, and the area is not zoned for that.
If I were to have known about John renting out his place as if it were a hotel, I would not have purchased that house.
You can't do that. You're not allowed to rent out like this.
You listen.
I brought up the housing rules, and he's like, oh, no, there's no housing rules here.
John contends no one said anything about rules in the entire 6 years he's lived here.
Do whatever I want.
He wasn't held to those rules after he moved in. And the more that he got away with breaking those rules, the more interested he became in believing he can continue to do them, and nobody can tell him otherwise.
John definitely felt he was being harassed. He wasn't doing anything wrong in his opinion, and if I want to rent my bedrooms out to anybody I want, that's my choice.
The Mounces don't see it that way.
John knew exactly the neighborhood that he moved into. He knew the papers that he signed when he bought his house, and he knew the rules that he had to follow.
He didn't think there was a problem at all. He vented to me about the problem he has with the neighbor next door, Eric.
He was not going to be told what to do by the Mounces. I heard that what he said was, they're not going to tell me what to do on my own property.
John was trying to be a nuisance to us. When Abigail would get home, John would start hammering and turning on a skill saw outside of our kitchen window and prevent Abigail from concentrating, and then when she was done with her schoolwork, to go to sleep. Abigail had to resort to turning on a fan to drown out the noise from the skill saw and the hammering.
Whenever we asked John to stop making so much noise, he would ignore us.
John was angry that his lifestyle was being challenged. He needed these tenants to pay his bills.
Then, something mysterious happens on the Mounces' property that takes everything to a new level.
I came out, and the right side of my barbecue was dented. It looked like a hammer had been taken.
Eric thought that John is the one who had done this. He was the only one who had complained. There was no one else in the neighborhood who would have any reason to come over.
And guess what's just right on the other side of the fence? All his tools, and my gate is right there.
Curiously, there's reports of other crimes throughout Meadow Charm, right around the same time.
We were told by several neighbors that there had been burglaries in the area.
Cars and houses that had been robbed. That was a shock to us. We put security cameras up on our house for protection.
All of the trouble circles back to John.
There was concern amongst the neighbors that it was the tenants that John was renting to that were robbing the neighborhood.
It caused some conflict in the neighborhood. People were grumbling about it. My next-door neighbor's car had been broken into numerous times, and he had seen tenants coming from John's house.
I felt John would rent to anybody with a heartbeat, and the fact that police had been there numerous occasions further backed my worst fears.
It seemed like John's tenants had no regard for the neighborhood.
By this time, I'm beginning to doubt that we bought the right house.
Did you hear something?
Because we were living next to this guy.
The couple becomes determined to get what they were promised.
Do we have a homeowner's agreement?
Yeah.
You know,
A neighborhood that's safe and orderly enough to raise a family in.
This is getting a little ridiculous.
Absolutely ridiculous.
We reviewed the neighborhood rules and found that it was the developer who was in charge of enforcing the rules. So we called him numerous times.
The developer was of no help when we asked him for it.
And we felt like we were on our own.
Eric and Abigail rally other neighbors in their efforts to restore order to the community.
Following the neighborhood rules would mean peaceful, quiet life for everyone involved.
There are sets of rules, and do's and don'ts of a neighborhood. You know, you can't paint your house black or have a big rig truck in your driveway or in your lawn. There's certain rules you have to abide by, which help maintain the quality of life and the value of the neighborhood. And I'm for that. And so is Eric.
John Kendall clearly isn't. And no matter where they turn for help, the Mounces keep coming up empty.
I spoke with this guy from the Homeowners Association, and I started talking to him about John, and he interrupted me on the phone and told me, that's your ball of wax. You're on your own with that.
It's a clear-cut victory for John, and he's got a plan to stop Eric and Abigail's meddling.
He erected a tarp over the top of his fence to try to hide our view of what he was doing. I was an eyesore, it was tacky.
What are you doing?
John said he put the tarp up so that we couldn't watch his grandchildren, but he doesn't have any grandchildren.
John figures he'll show his neighbors what it's like to be spied on.
He attached this halogen light on the side of the shed. It illuminated the inside, the whole house, and it was ridiculous. He would just stand and stare right into our window, hammering.
And it was really unsettling because I felt exposed. He was violating our privacy. It was an act of intimidation.
John is sending a message. If Eric and Abigail are ever going to realize their dream life, they'll have to fight for it.
We're not doing it.
Harassing.
I was becoming more anxious because of the interactions.
You threatened my wife!
I view John as a problem and not a neighbor.
No problems at all until you moved in here. Hey, Eric! Smoky, eh?
Hey, Eric, can you control that smoke?
I think John and Eric both enjoyed the neighborhood, but their lifestyles clashed.
That made me feel very frustrated.
Perfect.
Being neighborly is supposed to be about watching out for each other.
Oh, hey, that's great. Okay.
But for Eric and Abigail Mounce and their neighbor, John Kendall, there is only suspicion, intimidation, and mounting tension. One morning, things get decidedly worse.
We had noticed that the trees that line our property were starting to turn brown, and we couldn't figure out why because we take real good care of our shrubbery.
I think he was poisoning your trees.
We noticed they were dying.
I shared with Eric what I had seen. I saw that John went into his garage, and a few minutes later he came out, and I watched him walk gingerly on his own property as close as he could to the property line, and then he tossed this golden brown substance onto Eric's trees in his landscaping. I thought this was rather bizarre behavior.
He was poisoning my trees. It ended up being a yelling match between John and I.
Poison my trees! You've gone too far!
And John just got in my face and he put his hands up on his head and just kind of did this and was sticking his tongue out at me.
You're another level of crazy, you know that?
John seemed to have a Jekyll and Hyde kind of personality.
Yeah, like me?
Eric! You're all wet!
John shot me in the face with a water gun.
Eric calls the police, insisting John be charged with assault.
Sorry.
But John has his own version of events.
John claimed that I had assaulted him. John was claiming to the police that I'd threatened to rape him. And at that point, I knew that he was crazy.
You know, you didn't think it was in jest?
The police kind of laughed it off because they believed that it was a joke.
When the police left, I felt like we weren't getting anywhere with anybody's help and that we were on our own and we still had to take these matters into our own hands.
Thank you, officer.
And now that John's shed is finished, it's like living next to a toxic waste dump.
Well, I hope this smells better than that.
The amount of dust that was created inside his shed was a problem. He also used chemicals, some sort of chemical that left a green film. It just made a mess.
We have to do something about it.
John felt whatever he did at his home was his business, and to hell with everybody.
Pushed to the limit, the Mounces retain a civil lawyer, Denise Lukens.
I've done homeowners association disputes before. I've done a lot of boundary disputes. The neighbor dispute is worse than family law because if you're divorcing your spouse, you don't ever have to see them again. If it's your neighbor, they're right there every day.
We have to take some type of...
I truly felt that if we had our day in court with John, that our issues would be solved.
I'm sure I can help.
Their legal measures begin very simply, with a written request for John to take down his shed, stop working from home, and evict his tenants. It seems simple enough.
Denise sent John a letter via certified mail giving him 30 days to comply or we would continue to move forward.
Tell him to shove it.
Well, he refused the registered letter. I mean, it actually came back to me and said refused on it.
I don't think John was taking this seriously.
Hey! What the hell is wrong with you guys?
John's behavior became more belligerent when he found out that we were taking legal actions.
Here's a guy that just wanted to do his own thing. Now here comes the legal system, and this is something that really has some teeth in it. Of course, it made him more angry.
As the feud continued, John became more desperate, I believe. Eric told me a couple times John would yell at him and curse at him.
Not over here!
John yelled at me, "Why can't you just live here and let me do my own thing?"
Let me do my own thing!
The Mounces' legal actions are pushing John into a corner.
John did definitely feel bullied by Abigail and Eric. Not only did he feel he was right, this was his way of making his money, his income. So he felt he had to fight for what he felt was right.
John's tenants aren't helping the situation.
Police were called to the house due to fights, alleged drug activity, and numerous problems with these individuals. It was a troubled house with troubled people.
And then the Mounces learn John has a plan to give them even more grief.
He wanted to work out a deal with the county to rent out his rooms to sex offenders.
I was horrified because one of the reasons why we moved was to be able to start a family, and I do not want to raise children next to a halfway house for sexual offenders.
So our plans for having a family got put on hold. John was ruining our lives.
When 30 days pass and John still hasn't evicted his tenants, removed his shed, or stopped working from home, Eric and Abigail take him to court. John represents himself.
He kept dropping his papers. He would pick his papers up and take a step and drop more papers, and he kept bumping into things. He bumped into like a bench. He bumped into the desks. It was just odd to see him act like that.
He didn't seem like the smartest guy in the world. He was very difficult to talk to because he would just say these bizarre things that had nothing to do with the questions. In some sense, I can understand John's frustration. It would be hard to be self-represented. It must be scary, I guess, to feel like you're part of a system that you don't really understand.
The judge's ruling leaves nothing in doubt.
The court decided that he had to remove his tenants within 30 days and cease all the other activities that were in our original complaint. He had to stop his vacuum cleaner business. He had to remove the shed. He had to remove all the nuisances that he had put up.
If John doesn't cooperate, he'll be hit hard with fines.
The judge awarded us close to $3,000 each month that he was in violation of the neighborhood rules.
Abigail and I were very happy about the court's decision. We felt that we had finally gotten somewhere.
Their neighbor's in a tough spot. Without his business and his tenants, he faces financial ruin.
John became furious after he lost his court battles with Eric and Abigail.
I left the house to go get the mail, and John approached me, and he said that if my husband didn't back off, that one of us was going to end up dead.
Please. If you guys don't stop this,
John, please.
one of us is going to end up 6 feet under.
John threatened me, and that really frightened me.
John.
It's going to be like one of those stories you hear about on the news.
I was shaken up because it was the first time anybody's ever directly threatened me. I called my husband. I told him what had happened.
I left work immediately and I went home.
What the hell is the matter with you?
I went next door to talk to John.
What the hell's wrong with you? I don't know what you got.
And I said, don't threaten my wife again. And he was belligerent. I couldn't understand a word he was saying. His words were slurring.
I'm SOB. Yes, you are. Touch me.
He said, if you and your wife continue moving forward with this, I'm going to kill you.
I am going to kill both of you.
The man was losing it. He was definitely losing it.
Neighborly relations are boiling over. And pretty soon, both sides will be armed for war.
John had a gun collection.
We decided to make the decision to protect ourselves.
Everybody's capable of something if the right buttons are pushed.
I deserve some respect!
For exclusive footage, go to investigationdiscovery.com.
You started everything.
Like I couldn't.
The feud between Eric and John definitely became ugly.
John.
John seemed to be a loose cannon, and you just didn't know what was going to be happening next with him.
John, please.
One of us is going to end up 6 feet under.
John.
When the court sides with Eric and Abigail mounts over John Kendall in a bitter neighborhood rules dispute, John makes a blood-curdling threat.
I am going to kill both of you.
Again, the police are called to our once quiet and peaceful subdivision.
They went over and they talked to John. It looked like they handcuffed him and took him to the police cars. And then when they were at the police cars, they took the cuffs off of him. And they stood out there and talked for, I think, 30 minutes. I was hoping to get some sort of immediate action that would help curtail John's future activity, but they didn't do anything.
John lacked integrity. He would lie so much and twist stories around, trying to make Eric sound like the bad guy.
They let John go, and that was it. They didn't touch base with me. I didn't get any phone calls about what the police had said to John. They just talked to him and went away.
Afterwards, John makes it clear to everyone in Meadow Charm that he's fed up with all the harassment.
John was walking up and down the neighborhood with a handgun on his belt, and he was like strutting like he was trying to show it off. I think John was doing that to intimidate, and I think he was doing that to show everybody that he's now got a weapon.
I was afraid of John. I didn't trust him. I didn't know what he was capable of doing. He just didn't seem to be playing with the full deck.
And the handgun on John's hip is nothing compared to the arsenal of weapons he has at home.
Some of the neighbors knew that John had a gun collection. I don't think a lot of them did, let alone the power of the guns that he had.
I had warned Eric. I advised him and Abigail to get handguns for self-protection. I told him personally, I remember quoting, I said, I would be packing all the time if I were you, dude. Pack.
What choice do they have?
We felt it necessary to protect ourselves, so we purchased some handguns.
We found a local firing range, and we would go down there and practice firing the guns. We tried to carry the guns as often as we could.
I felt more protected when I had my gun on me.
Both parties in our neighborhood dispute are now armed, and it's not always the obvious one who snaps first.
Eric was stressed. It was taking a toll on him as well. I could tell he was going through a lot of legal wrangling with John, and it was taking a toll, without a doubt.
The tension rises as every month, John's debt to the Mounces grows by another $3,000.
The amount that John owed us added up really fast. We were looking at close to $60,000. John didn't care. John didn't change a thing.
The couple applies relentless legal pressure until John finally makes a concession. He knocks down his shed, but still won't evict his tenants or pay his neighbors the money he owes them.
I'd had a belly full of John. I felt like we'd done everything we needed to do. We'd been to court 3 or 4 times, and he simply wasn't listening.
John has to listen to this, though. He's been summoned to appear in court a final time to decide everything.
A motion was filed for his possible incarceration for breaking the rules and for contempt, basically. So the seed was sown that, hey, I could go to jail because of this next hearing, October 31st.
We were seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. We know the judge is going to swing her gavel for the last time, and we know it's going to be in our favor.
John probably felt backed against a corner. He's going to lose his house. He won't have the money. You can never say for sure what you're going to do when you find yourself facing losing your living situation.
Some things like that could make a man snap. A single older gentleman, never married, no kids. In my opinion, he's the type of guy who has absolutely nothing to lose.
The day before Halloween, Denise Lukens hears a commotion in the lobby of her law office.
Why are you coming after me? I deserve some respect!
John Kendall had called me and demanded to talk to me, and I didn't really want to talk to him at that point. So the next day, October 30th, he showed up at my office, and it made me a little uneasy. What's he doing here?
You should be proud!
In 24 hours, John could be facing a prison sentence. His behavior is highly disturbing.
I need 5 minutes.
He started complaining about things and trying to tell his side of the story, and he said, you should be proud of yourself defending a punk like Eric Mounts against a wounded veteran like me.
I fought for this country! You're taking everything away from me!
And he wouldn't leave. My receptionist asked him to leave a couple of times. Finally, my landlord came out and escorted him away. It really was very strange, and I'm starting to get concerned about my personal safety.
I need 5 minutes.
His bizarre visit is just the tipping point.
We had a feeling that something might happen with John, that he might do something, but we didn't know what it was.
The very next day, Halloween, begins with a mix of anticipation and excitement.
October 31st was the last day that we would be in court. It was going to be the final judgment from the judge. She was going to issue the writ to have the tenants removed from John's house by the sheriff. That would be the end of it.
We were both really excited because we had the day off. We both got ready for court, and we backed out of our driveway and started heading towards the main street.
I looked in my rearview mirror, and I see John running out of his house. I've never seen that guy run, and I'm thinking, okay, he's going to go to the courthouse. I get down to the intersection of 63rd and Andreessen, and I see his car behind me. I just put my gaze forward. At that time, I'm at the red light stationary.
I didn't know that he was behind us, but I saw him pull up onto the right side of me, and I kind of just I was like, what does he think he's doing, you know? And then I saw something poking out of his window.
John felt he wanted to take ultimate revenge.
I just couldn't believe it.
He just, in the end, snapped. Nobody had an idea that something like this could happen.
On their way to their final court date, Eric and Abigail Mounts see John Kendall running out of his house behind them. What they don't know is that he's heavily armed.
That was the darkest day that Vancouver's ever seen.
I think this was a premeditated event. I think he had an idea of what he was going to do and when he was going to do it. I hear a pop, pop, pop. The glass shattered on the right side. The windshield spidered. I hear Abigail say, "I can't see." I grab her and I say, "Get down." I heard her scream like she realized what had happened to her. It was a horrible scream.
I hear ringing. I couldn't see. Eric pulled me down. I don't remember hearing any gunfire. I don't remember feeling any pain. I do remember feeling blood like poured out my face and down the back of my neck and stuff.
Abigail is bleeding uncontrollably from a head wound. And John isn't done yet.
John went into the intersection, turned around, and drove down the driver's side of our car, firing.
Eric has no defense against John's semi-automatic AK-47, but miraculously escapes harm.
I had a gun in the car, but it was in our glove compartment. I put the car in drive, and I just sped as fast as I could through the intersection. I think I was doing 75, 80 in a matter of just a split second. I was doing everything I can to get around traffic. I kept honking the horn repeatedly. I kept my left hand on the wheel and my foot on the gas, and I was frantically trying to dial 911.
911, you calling about the shots fired?
Yeah, someone else, the shot in the head!
I cannot understand you.
Oh,
Are you shot?
no! My wife here, she shot in the head, I took her to the hospital!
I'm holding Abigail. I think she's choking, coughing, gurgling. There's blood all over me.
I remember feeling him go over a bunch of curbs to get around traffic. I remember finally getting to the hospital. I still couldn't see anything.
I ran out of the car and just screamed, "My wife's been shot in the head." And everybody just kind of looked at me in horror because I was covered in blood.
Okay, Abby.
The medical personnel were pulling Abigail out of the car. I just kind of collapsed to my knees and sat there for a moment. I was crying.
I remember them asking me questions like, who did this to me? And then I passed out.
Abby, I'm here. Abby, I'm here.
It was all surreal. I called Denise because I didn't know where John was, and I wanted to make sure that he wasn't going for her. And she just became frantic on the phone.
He said, "John shot Abigail." I said, "What?" And he was incoherent. I asked him, "So where's John now?" And he said, "I don't know. Don't go to court. Don't go to court." Almost immediately after that, the SWAT team got to my building. There must have been 20 police cars with their sirens going. Things were really chaotic.
Throughout Vancouver, there's a massive manhunt underway.
It was really terrifying. Nobody knew where he was.
I walked out the door and was immediately stopped by newspaper reporters who wanted to talk to me about my neighbors. And there were cop cars and news vans were pulling up, and everything was just kind of unfolding in front of me.
It was an all-hands-on-deck situation. Everybody was out in full force trying to figure out what exactly is going on, where this guy is.
And as doctors struggle to save Abigail Mounts, John Kendall reaches the end of his rope.
He didn't want to face what he had to face. So John, I suppose you could say he laid down his own justice.
His body is discovered 2.5 hours after Eric's 911 call. Following extensive surgery, Abigail finally regains consciousness.
When I woke up, I didn't know what had happened. I had asked where John was, and Eric had told me he committed suicide, and I was angry because I felt that John deserved to go through the legal system to answer for his crimes.
I'm sad that he felt that the legal issues that we had with him had to culminate in this ending.
Abigail and Eric are still recovering from the horror of that fateful day.
John fired a total of like 17 shots.
I was hit with 2 bullets. A bullet had shattered my cheek just below my right eye, and I now have many bullet fragments in my brain.
The second bullet entered right below her temple area, went under, then exited out behind her ear and blew the top part of her ear off. She lost 40% hearing in her ear. She lost her eye. She has a collapsed sinus, and the orbital socket needs to be repaired as well. It's a miracle that she survived.
On that day, my whole life changed. I was overwhelmed with the amount of support that I had received from my family and my community.
I can't change what happened, but was there...
The desert keeps secrets better than any city ever could. Out beyond the neon glare of Las Vegas, where the highway cuts through miles of silent Nevada scrubland, the night of October 17th, 1991 began like any other. The air was cold, thin, dry enough to crack your lips if you stayed outside too long. Pickup trucks rumbled along the dark highway. A lonely gas station hummed under flickering fluorescent lights. And somewhere along a forgotten service road, 20 miles outside the city, something happened that would haunt investigators for more than 30 years. At 6:42 the next morning, a county road maintenance worker named Daniel Ortiz steered his dusty state truck onto that same service road. He was looking for a drainage blockage reported after a rare desert storm. The road was quiet, the kind of quiet that swallows sound. Tires crunching gravel, wind scraping through dry brush. Then he saw it. At first, it looked like discarded trash. A pale shape half hidden in the weeds beside a rusted cattle fence. He slowed, stopped the truck, walked closer, and then he froze. Because the pale shape wasn't trash. It was a body. A young woman lying on her side, face turned toward the dirt, hair tangled with desert grass. Her jacket was torn, one shoe missing, her hands bound loosely with a strip of cloth that looked like it had been ripped from a shirt. Daniel stepped back slowly, heart pounding, the desert suddenly feeling much larger and much emptier. Within an hour, flashing patrol lights pierced the quiet road. By noon, the story had reached the small nearby town of Mesquite, Nevada, population barely 4,000 at the time. And just like that, a mystery was born. A mystery that would refuse to die. The victim was identified that same evening. Her name was Emily Carter, 22 years old, college student, waitress at a diner off Interstate 15. Bright smile, blonde hair, Known by friends as someone who laughed too loudly and trusted people too easily. She had vanished the night before. Now she was lying in the desert. The scene itself was unsettling, but not chaotic. There were no obvious tire tracks close to the body. No weapon found nearby. No purse, no wallet, no identification. Just Emily. And silence. Detectives from the Clark County Sheriff's Office arrived quickly. Among them was Detective Paul Ramirez, a seasoned investigator who had seen his share of violent crime. But even he later admitted there was something unsettling about the stillness of that scene. The desert wind had already started erasing things. Footprints blurred. Loose sand shifting. The first question was obvious. What was Emily Carter doing 20 miles outside town in the middle of a night? Her last confirmed sighting had been inside the Silver Spur Diner at 10:13 p.m. the previous evening. The diner was a small roadside place. Neon coffee sign buzzing in the window, chrome stools, the smell of fried bacon that seemed permanently soaked into the walls. Emily had finished her shift there. Coworkers said she seemed normal, maybe a little tired. She joked with the cook, clocked out, grabbed her denim jacket, and stepped into the parking lot. She was supposed to drive straight home. Her apartment was only 8 minutes away. But she never made it. Her car, a faded blue 1986 Honda Civic, was found 2 days later in the far corner of the diner parking lot. Locked. Keys missing. Which meant something strange had happened between the moment she walked out the door and the moment she was supposed to start the engine. Someone had intercepted her. The question was who? And why? Detectives began knocking on doors the very next morning. Friends, co-workers, regular customers at the diner. Anyone who might have seen something. A truck driver remembered seeing Emily talking to a man in the parking lot around 10:20 p.m. But the description was vague. White male. Maybe mid-30s. Baseball cap. Dark jacket. That was it. In a town where half the men owned baseball caps and dark jackets, the clue meant almost nothing. Still, investigators followed every possible lead. They tracked down truckers who had stopped at the diner that night. They interviewed locals. They pulled phone records. They even checked nearby motels for suspicious guests. Nothing stuck. Then came the autopsy. And the results made the case even darker. Emily Carter had been strangled. There were signs of a violent struggle. Defensive wounds on her hands. Bruising on her wrists where the cloth bindings had cut into her skin. The medical examiner estimated she had died sometime between midnight and 2 a.m., which meant she had likely been alive for at least an hour after leaving work. An hour no one could account for. An hour that vanished into the Nevada night. The case quickly dominated local headlines. College student found dead in desert. Community shocked by brutal killing. Mesquite wasn't used to murders like this. People locked their doors that week. Parents walked their kids to school. The diner installed new outdoor lights. And Detective Ramirez began assembling what he hoped would become a clear timeline. But timelines in cases like this have a way of unraveling. Emily had plans the next day. She was supposed to meet a friend for breakfast. Her textbooks were still open on the kitchen table. Her answering machine had 2 unheard messages. Life had been moving forward. Then suddenly it wasn't. Investigators examined her car carefully. Inside, they found nothing unusual. No signs of struggle. No blood. No fingerprints that didn't belong. It was almost as if Emily had never even gotten into the vehicle, which brought them back to the parking lot. And the mysterious man. Weeks passed. The investigation widened. Hundreds of interviews. Dozens of tips. Most went nowhere. But one tip stood out. A teenage gas station clerk claimed she had seen a truck speeding down the highway around midnight the night Emily disappeared. An older pickup. Dark color. 2 people inside. The passenger looked like a woman. Maybe struggling. But the clerk couldn't see clearly. Headlights blinded her. The truck was gone in seconds. Still, detectives took it seriously. They began looking for dark pickups, which in rural Nevada was like looking for grains of sand in the desert. Meanwhile, forensic evidence was limited. 1991 wasn't the age of advanced DNA databases. Investigators collected fibers. hair samples, trace evidence from Emily's clothing. But technology at the time simply wasn't strong enough to give clear answers. The evidence was stored carefully in sealed boxes. Waiting. Months turned into a year. The leads dried up. The mysterious man in the baseball cap was never identified. The pickup truck was never found. No weapon. No witnesses.
No confession.
The case slowly slid into the category detectives hate most. Unsolved homicide. A cold case. For Emily Carter's family, the silence was unbearable. Her mother kept Emily's bedroom exactly the same. Her father called detectives every few months asking the same question. Any news? The answer was always the same.
No.
Years passed. Detective Ramirez eventually retired. New investigators inherited the file. Boxes of photographs. Witness statements. Evidence bags. Thousands of pages documenting a murder that no one could explain. Every few years, someone reopened the case. They reviewed the timeline, re-interviewed old witnesses, chased rumors. But the trail always vanished into the same empty desert where Emily had been found. And for 3 decades, that is where the truth remained buried. Until a routine genealogy test, something so ordinary, so mundane, suddenly cracked open a door investigators had believed sealed forever. A door leading back to October 17, 1991. Back to the diner parking lot. Back to the man in the baseball cap. And to a suspect no one had ever imagined. But to understand how that happened, investigators would first have to return to the beginning. Back to the night Emily Carter walked out of the Silver Spur Diner. Back to the moment someone decided she wasn't going home. The Silver Spur Diner was the kind of place where nothing was supposed to happen. A narrow building crouched beside Interstate 15, glowing with tired neon that flickered against the desert dark. Truckers stopped there for coffee strong enough to keep them awake through the empty miles of Nevada highway. Locals came for late-night burgers, gossip, and the quiet comfort of routine. Every booth had a story. Every regular had a seat they claimed, without asking. And on the night of October 16, 1991, Emily Carter moved through that diner, like she always did. Refilling coffee cups, sliding plates across the counter, laughing when the cook burned another batch of fries. The security camera inside the diner, a grainy black and white system mounted above the register, captured her in fragments. A flash of blonde hair, a quick smile, a blur of movement behind the counter. At 9:57 p.m., the dinner rush was fading. Only a handful of customers remained. A truck driver finishing a slice of pie. 2 college kids arguing over a math problem. And a man sitting alone in a corner booth near the window. No one remembered when he came in. That would become one of the most frustrating details in the entire investigation, because nobody could say exactly when he appeared, or exactly when he left. But several people remembered him. Not clearly. Just enough to haunt the case. He wore a baseball cap, pulled low. Dark jacket. Tall, maybe 6 feet. Quiet. The cook later said the man barely touched his coffee. Just sat there watching the room. Watching Emily. At 10:11 p.m., Emily walked over to the booth with the check. The man said something. No one heard what. But the conversation lasted longer than a normal goodbye. 2 minutes. Maybe 3. Then Emily nodded. And the man stood up. He paid in cash. Left no receipt. No name. No credit card. Nothing traceable. 2 minutes later, Emily clocked out. 10:13 p.m. The timestamp sat frozen in the diner's timecard machine for decades. She grabbed her denim jacket, said goodnight to the cook, and pushed open the glass door into the parking lot. The last confirmed moment anyone ever saw her alive. Outside, the desert night had settled in thick and cold. The diner parking lot was lit by a pair of buzzing yellow lamps that cast long shadows across the gravel. Emily's blue Honda Civic sat in the far corner, just as it always did. But something strange happened in those few minutes outside. Something that would puzzle detectives for years. Because several customers inside the diner remembered seeing Emily stop beside a truck. Not her car. A truck. Dark-colored. Parked near the edge of the lot. The driver's door was open, and someone was standing beside it. The man in the baseball cap. At least, that's what witnesses believed. One truck driver later told police he saw Emily leaning slightly toward the open door, as if speaking with the driver. He didn't think much of it at the time. People talked in parking lots all the time. But now, years later, that brief moment felt like the center of the entire mystery. Because Emily never reached her car. Instead, she vanished. The parking lot itself offered almost no clues. When investigators examined the area the next morning, the gravel surface had already been disturbed by dozens of vehicles. Any tire marks from the previous night were gone. Any footprints erased. Only the faint outline of Emily's Civic remained where it had been parked. Locked. Silent. Waiting. Inside the diner, detectives started reconstructing the timeline minute by minute. 10:13 p.m. Emily leaves the building. 10:15 p.m. A customer remembers hearing a truck engine start. 10:16 p.m. Headlights pull out of the parking lot. After that, nothing. The highway swallowed the vehicle. No cameras on the road. No toll booths. Just miles of open desert. Detective Paul Ramirez spent hours studying the diner's security footage. But the camera only pointed toward the register and counter area. The door was barely visible in the corner of the frame. People passed through like shadows. At 10:12 p.m., the man in the baseball cap walked past the camera. His face never fully visible. The brim of the cap hid everything. A ghost in a grainy recording. Ramirez paused the tape again and again. Rewound it.
Zoomed in.
But the technology of 1991 could only reveal so much. The man remained faceless. And the truck outside was never captured at all. Investigators tried building a profile. Maybe the man was a trucker. Maybe a drifter passing through. Maybe someone local. Each theory led to dozens of possibilities. None led to an arrest. Weeks later, the case took another strange turn. Emily's friend, Lisa Morgan, came forward with something she had initially dismissed as unimportant. But now it sounded different. 2 days before Emily died, the two women had been studying together in Emily's apartment. At some point, Emily had mentioned a customer from the diner. A man who had come in several times that week. Quiet. Watching her. Not in a friendly way. More like studying. Lisa remembered Emily joking about it. Maybe he's writing a book about coffee. But the comment had unsettled her. Enough that she remembered it days later. Detectives immediately followed the lead. They showed Lisa photos of known offenders in the area. Local criminals. Drifters. Truck drivers with records. But none of the faces matched. The man remained unknown. And the investigation slowly began running out of roads to follow. Then came the discovery of Emily's missing shoe. 3 weeks after the body was found, a rancher riding his horse across nearby land spotted something caught in the brush nearly half a mile from where Emily had been discovered. A white sneaker. One of Emily's. The location raised a disturbing possibility. Emily may have tried to run. Maybe she escaped the vehicle briefly. Maybe there was a struggle in the darkness. Maybe she lost the shoe during that desperate moment. But again, the desert offered no witnesses. Only speculation. The distance between the shoe and the body suggested movement. But in which direction? Had she run toward the road? Or away from it? No one could say. Investigators combed the area for more evidence. Metal detectors. Search teams.
Dogs.
But whatever had happened that night had already been swallowed by wind and time. And then, just when detectives thought the trail couldn't grow colder, another strange detail emerged. One that seemed almost meaningless at first, until decades later. During the autopsy, the medical examiner found a single foreign hair tangled in Emily's jacket collar. Dark brown.
Short.
Possibly male. In 1991, DNA technology was still in its infancy. The sample was preserved, logged into evidence, and placed in a sealed bag inside the department's storage room, where it would remain untouched for nearly 30 years. Back then, investigators could only run basic tests. Blood type. Microscopic comparison. The hair produced almost nothing useful. No match. No suspect. Just another unanswered question. And so the case stalled. Months turned into years. The man in the baseball cap faded into rumor. The truck became a ghost vehicle. Witness memories blurred. Detectives transferred to other cases. Some retired. Some passed away. And the file labeled Carter, Emily, homicide slowly thickened with dust. But the community never fully forgot. Every October, someone left flowers at the spot where her body had been found. Drivers passing along that lonely service road sometimes slowed down without knowing why. And the Silver Spur Diner kept serving coffee under the same flickering neon sign. But every employee knew the story. The waitress who walked out one night and never came back. Years later, the diner would close. The building abandoned. Windows boarded. Paint peeling under the desert sun. Yet inside police archives, the evidence boxes remained exactly where they had been stored in 1991. Waiting for technology to catch up. Waiting for a clue that didn't exist yet. Waiting for a break no one could predict. And eventually, decades later, that break would come from a place investigators never imagined. Not from a witness. Not from a confession. But from a quiet revolution in forensic science. A revolution built on something incredibly simple. Family trees, DNA databases, and ordinary people sending saliva samples through the mail. A routine genealogy test. The kind millions of Americans were taking out of curiosity. Tests meant to reveal ancestry, long-lost relatives, family origins. No one taking those tests ever expected they might solve a murder. But somewhere in the United States, decades after Emily Carter disappeared into the Nevada night, a distant relative of a killer would spit into a plastic tube, seal the package, mail it to a laboratory, and unknowingly light the fuse that would reopen one of Nevada's most haunting cold cases. A fuse that would lead investigators back to that desert road, back to the diner parking lot, back to the man whose face had been hidden under the brim of a baseball cap. A man who had believed the desert would bury the truth forever. But the desert was about to give something back. And when it did, the name that surfaced would shock everyone connected to the case. For nearly 3 decades, the evidence from Emily Carter's murder sat inside a climate-controlled storage room deep within the Clark County Evidence Facility. Rows of metal shelves, gray cardboard boxes, labels faded by time. Inside one of those boxes, sealed in a clear plastic envelope, was a single strand of hair. Dark brown, barely visible against the evidence card. Collected in October 1991.
Logged. Filed.
Forgotten. Back then, forensic technology had reached its limits. Detectives had done everything the science of the early 90s allowed. Microscopic comparison suggested the hair likely belonged to a male, but without a suspect to compare it against, the information meant nothing. No database. No automated search. Just a piece of biological evidence with nowhere to go. And so the file slowly became what investigators call a true cold case. Not inactive, not abandoned, but frozen. Every few years a new detective would inherit the file. They would sit down with the same thick stack of documents, witness interviews, crime scene photos, autopsy reports, and ask the same question every investigator had asked since 1991. What are we missing? The answer always seemed to be the same. Nothing. The problem wasn't missing evidence. The problem was that the evidence pointed nowhere. Until the year 2019. By then, something extraordinary had happened in the world of criminal investigations. A quiet revolution had begun. One that started not in police stations or crime labs, but inside living rooms across America. People had become fascinated with their ancestry. Millions of ordinary citizens were mailing saliva samples to companies offering genetic genealogy tests. The promise was simple: discover where your family came from, find distant relatives, build a digital family tree stretching back generations. It seemed harmless, even exciting. But those databases were growing larger every day. And investigators had begun to realize something powerful. Even if a suspect had never submitted their own DNA, a relative might have. A cousin, a second cousin, a third cousin. One genetic match could point investigators toward an entire family line. The technique had already solved several famous cold cases. Cases once considered impossible. Murders from the 1970s. Disappearances from the 1980s. Suddenly, decades-old evidence had a new purpose. And in Nevada, someone inside the Clark County Sheriff's Office decided it was time to try. Detective Laura Bennett had been working cold cases for nearly 5 years when she first opened Emily Carter's file. She was methodical, patient, the kind of investigator who believed time didn't erase truth, it only buried it. When Bennett reviewed the evidence list, one item immediately caught her attention. Foreign hair recovered from victim's jacket collar. Preserved. Untested with modern DNA methods. She stared at the note for a long moment. Because by 2019, forensic technology had evolved dramatically. The question wasn't whether DNA could be extracted. The question was whether enough genetic material remained after nearly 30 years. Still, it was worth trying. The evidence box was retrieved from storage. Gloves on. Chain of custody verified. The sealed bag opened for the first time in decades. Inside, the tiny hair was transferred to a modern forensic lab specializing in degraded DNA samples. Technicians worked slowly.
Carefully.
The hair had no root attached, something that once would have made DNA extraction nearly impossible. But newer techniques could sometimes recover genetic information even from the shaft of the hair itself. Days passed. Then weeks. Finally, the lab returned with news. They had recovered partial DNA. Not perfect, but enough to build a genetic profile. Detective Bennett immediately pushed the next step forward. Instead of comparing the DNA against traditional criminal databases like CODIS, the sample was submitted for forensic genealogy analysis, which meant building a genetic profile that could be compared to public ancestry databases used by everyday people. The process wasn't instant. Far from it. First, the DNA profile had to be converted into a format compatible with genealogy platforms. Then analysts began searching for partial matches. Not suspects. Relatives. Distant genetic connections. And the results were modest. No close relatives appeared.
No siblings. No parents.
But there were several distant matches. Third cousins. Fourth cousins. People sharing tiny fragments of DNA with the unknown suspect. To a normal person, those matches would mean nothing. But to a genealogist, they were the beginning of a map. A map leading backward through generations. Family trees were constructed. Birth records examined. Marriage licenses traced. Branches of families stretching across multiple states. Slowly, patiently, investigators began narrowing the possibilities. Some branches were eliminated quickly. Wrong geography. Wrong timelines. But one particular family line kept appearing in the data. A line that traced back to Arizona. From there, descendants had spread across the Southwest. California.
Utah.
Nevada. Detective Bennett began assembling a list of potential individuals connected to that genetic line.
Men.
Age range roughly matching someone who might have been in their 30s in 1991. The list was long. Too long. Dozens of names. But one detail caught Bennett's attention immediately. One of those men had once lived less than 30 miles from Mesquite, Nevada. His name was Daniel Mercer. In 1991, Mercer had been 34 years old. Construction worker. Occasional mechanic. Known to drift between short-term jobs. But what truly made Bennett pause was something else. A detail buried deep inside an old employment record. In the fall of 1991, Mercer had briefly worked maintenance at a truck depot just off Interstate 15. Less than 10 miles from the Silver Spur Diner. It wasn't proof. Not even close. But after 30 years of silence, it was something investigators had never had before.
A name.
And that name opened a door. Detective Bennett began digging into Mercer's past. Criminal history. Addresses. Employment. Neighbors.
Friends.
At first glance, nothing about his record screamed murder.
No homicide arrests.
No major violent convictions. But there were small things. Disturbances.
Fights.
a restraining order filed by a former girlfriend in 1994, another assault complaint years later that had been quietly dropped. Nothing that would have put him on a homicide detective's radar. Until now. And then Bennett discovered something else. In October 1991, the exact week Emily Carter disappeared, Mercer owned a dark pickup truck. A 1984 Ford F-150. The same type witnesses had described leaving the diner parking lot that night. For the first time in 3 decades, the investigation had a direction. But investigators still faced a critical problem. Genetic genealogy can suggest a suspect. It cannot prove guilt in court. To confirm the connection, detectives would need Mercer's DNA. And that meant one thing. They needed to find him. But by 2019, Daniel Mercer was no longer living in Nevada. In fact, he had vanished from the area years earlier. Moved. Changed addresses repeatedly. Disappeared into the sprawl of the American West. The search began immediately. Investigators tracked old driver's licenses, utility records, employment files. Slowly, a trail emerged. Daniel Mercer had eventually settled in a small town nearly 600 miles away. A quiet place where no one knew anything about a murder in Nevada, where he had lived quietly for years, working odd jobs, keeping mostly to himself. To his neighbors, he was just another aging man with a pickup truck and a small house on the edge of town. No one suspected the past that might be following him. But in Nevada, detectives were watching now. Carefully, patiently. Because if the genealogy trail was correct, the man who had vanished from the diner parking lot in 1991 had just stepped back into the light. And the truth buried in the desert for nearly 30 years was finally starting to move. By the spring of 2020, the name Daniel Mercer had moved from a line in a genealogy chart to the center of a homicide investigation that had been frozen for nearly 30 years. Detective Laura Bennett understood the danger of rushing to conclusions. Genetic genealogy could point investigators in the right direction, but it was not proof. Courts demanded certainty. Juries demanded evidence that could not be explained away. Right now, Mercer was only a possibility. But the deeper Bennett dug into his past, the more that possibility began to feel like something darker. Mercer had been born in 1957 in rural Arizona. A quiet childhood according to the few records that existed. His father worked construction. His mother cleaned motel rooms along Highway 93. The family moved often. Trailer parks. Cheap rentals. Temporary places that left almost no paper trail. By the late 1980s, Mercer had drifted into Nevada. The state was booming then, casinos expanding, highways stretching deeper into the desert, construction jobs everywhere. Men like Mercer could always find work. And he did. Short contracts. Road crews. Truck yards. Mechanic shops. Always moving. Always temporary. What investigators found most interesting was where Mercer had been living in October of 1991. A trailer park outside Mesquite. Just 14 minutes from the Silver Spur Diner. The same diner where Emily Carter had worked. The same diner where witnesses had seen a man in a baseball cap sitting alone in a booth. The connection tightened. But detectives needed more. Bennett contacted retired investigators who had originally worked the case decades earlier. One of them was Paul Ramirez, now in his 70s, living quietly outside Las Vegas. When Bennett called him about the genealogy lead, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Ramirez spoke slowly. "You might be opening a ghost," he said. Ramirez still remembered the frustration of the Carter investigation. The endless interviews. The thin leads that always dissolved into nothing. But when Bennett mentioned Mercer's name, something strange happened. Ramirez paused again. Then he said something that made the room go quiet. "I think we talked to him." Bennett immediately leaned forward. Back in 1991, detectives had interviewed hundreds of people in the Mesquite area. Truck drivers, mechanics, construction workers, anyone who might have been near the diner that night. Ramirez pulled out his old notes. Yellowed pages. Handwritten lists. There it was. Daniel Mercer. Interviewed October 28, 1991. 11 days after Emily Carter's body was found. The note was brief. Local mechanic. drives dark Ford pickup, states he was home night of October 16th. No witnesses to confirm. At the time, Mercer had seemed unremarkable, one of many men with trucks, one of many locals passing through the diner during late-night hours. Detectives had moved on quickly. But now, decades later, that short interview felt different. Because Mercer had placed himself near the investigation, near the crime, and investigators had let him walk away. Detective Bennett sat in silence after reading the report. A man potentially connected by DNA had already spoken with police. And somehow, he had slipped through the cracks. But before detectives could confront Mercer, they needed something stronger. They needed his DNA. In modern investigations, obtaining a suspect's DNA without alerting them is often done through something surprisingly simple: discarded trash. A coffee cup, a soda bottle, a cigarette, anything carrying saliva. But to do that, investigators first needed to locate Mercer and observe him without raising suspicion. By summer, surveillance teams had identified Mercer's current residence. A small town several states away. Quiet streets, modest houses. The kind of place where neighbors waved from their driveways and everyone knew the sound of each other's cars. Mercer's house sat at the end of a narrow road lined with cottonwood trees. Single story. Faded paint. A pickup truck parked outside. Still driving a truck, investigators noticed. Different model now. But the habit remained. Surveillance began quietly. Unmarked vehicles rotated through the area. Detectives watched from a distance. The man they observed looked older than the photo from his driver's license. Gray hair, thicker around the waist. But the posture was the same. Quiet, reserved. He rarely spoke to neighbors. Spent long hours working in his garage. Sometimes driving into town for groceries. A routine life. Almost invisible. Nothing about the man's daily behavior suggested the violent past investigators were considering. But crimes like Emily Carter's were often committed by people who blended easily into ordinary life. That was the unsettling truth. One afternoon, after nearly a week of surveillance, Mercer stepped outside carrying a bag of trash. He walked to the curb, dropped it inside the bin, then went back into the house. Detectives waited. Late that night, once the street was empty, an investigator approached the garbage container. Gloves on, flashlight low. The bag was retrieved carefully. Inside were food wrappers, newspapers, empty soda cans, and a plastic water bottle. The bottle was sealed in an evidence bag, sent immediately to the forensic lab. Now came the waiting. If the DNA from that bottle matched the genetic profile extracted from the hair found on Emily Carter's jacket, the entire case would change. Days passed slowly. Detective Bennett avoided speculation. But everyone in the department understood the significance. 30 years of silence rested on the results of that test. Finally, the lab called. The match was confirmed. The DNA from Daniel Mercer's discarded bottle matched the DNA extracted from the hair recovered from Emily Carter's clothing. The odds of it belonging to someone else were astronomically small. For the first time since 1991, investigators could say something with confidence. The man whose DNA had been found on Emily Carter's jacket was alive. And they knew exactly where he was. But solving a cold case after 30 years isn't as simple as knocking on a door. Memories fade. Evidence degrades. Defense attorneys attack every weakness. Prosecutors would need more than DNA. They would need to rebuild the entire timeline of October 16, 1991.
Piece by piece.
Every witness. Every detail. Every forgotten clue. Because before they could make an arrest, they had to answer one final question.
Why?
Why had Daniel Mercer targeted Emily Carter? Was it random? A chance encounter in a diner parking lot? Or had he been watching her long before that night? Detective Bennett reopened every interview connected to the case. She studied the diner layout, re-examined witness statements, and slowly, a chilling possibility began to form. The man in the baseball cap may not have been a stranger at all. He may have been there many times before, sitting quietly, watching, waiting. And the more investigators looked back into the past, the clearer one disturbing pattern became. Daniel Mercer had not simply crossed paths with Emily Carter. He had been orbiting her world long before she disappeared into the Nevada desert. A detail no one had noticed in 1991. A detail buried in routine life. But one that now, decades later, was beginning to look like the first step in something far more deliberate. And if that was true, the murder of Emily Carter might not have been spontaneous at all. It might have been planned.
Carefully. Patiently.
By a man who believed time would erase his crime forever. But time had done something else. It had preserved the truth, waiting quietly inside a single strand of hair. When the DNA results confirmed that the genetic profile from Emily Carter's jacket matched Daniel Mercer, the investigation changed overnight. For nearly 30 years, the case had been a puzzle missing its center. Detectives had theories, witnesses, fragments of memory, but no one they could place at the heart of the crime. Now they had a name. And with that name came a terrifying new possibility that the man who had killed Emily Carter had quietly lived out 3 decades of normal life while her family waited for answers. But detectives knew something important. DNA could place Mercer in contact with Emily. It could not explain what happened in the dark hours between the diner parking lot and the desert road where her body was found. To prove murder in court, investigators had to rebuild that night minute by minute. And after 30 years, that meant digging through layers of forgotten details. Detective Laura Bennett returned to the beginning. The Silver Spur Diner. By 2020, the building no longer served coffee or late-night pie. The business had closed years earlier. The windows were boarded up, the neon sign removed, the parking lot cracked and filled with weeds. But when Bennett stepped onto the gravel where Emily had once walked out into the night, the layout still told a story. The building sat at the edge of the highway. A truck could pull in, park briefly, and leave again within seconds. No cameras. No traffic lights. Just darkness and the long stretch of Interstate 15 leading north and south across the Nevada desert. The perfect place for someone passing through. Or for someone waiting. Bennett began re-interviewing the few witnesses still alive. Most had moved away years earlier. Some had forgotten almost everything. But occasionally, buried inside faded memories, small details resurfaced. One of those witnesses was Frank Delaney, the truck driver who had originally told police about seeing Emily near a pickup truck that night. Frank was older now. His hands shook slightly when he held his coffee. But when Bennett asked about the diner, something flickered behind his eyes. "I remember the girl," he said quietly. "The waitress." He stared out the window for a moment before continuing. "There was a guy who came in a few times that week." Bennett leaned forward. "Same guy every time?" Frank nodded slowly. "Pretty sure, yeah." That detail had never appeared clearly in the original case file. Back then, investigators believed the man in the baseball cap had appeared only once, the night Emily vanished. But now Frank was describing something else. A pattern. "I saw him 3 nights in a row," Frank continued. "Always sitting by the window. Didn't talk much." "Did he speak to Emily before that night?" Frank frowned, trying to reach back through time. "Once maybe. Just small talk. But he watched her." Watched her. That word hung in the air. If Mercer had been visiting the diner repeatedly, it meant the encounter in the parking lot was not random. It meant he may have been studying Emily's routine. Learning when she worked, when she left, when the parking lot was quiet. The possibility shifted the entire case. Because now investigators weren't looking at a spontaneous crime. They were looking at something closer to stalking. Bennett tracked down another former diner employee, the cook who had worked that shift with Emily. His name was Tom Alvarez. Tom had been in his 20s in 1991. Now he was nearly 60. When Bennett showed him an age-progressed photograph of Daniel Mercer, Tom stared at it for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. "That's him." The confirmation sent a chill through the room. Tom described the man exactly the way witnesses had decades earlier.
Baseball cap. Dark jacket.
Quiet. But Tom added something else. "He made me uneasy," he said.
"How?"
Tom shrugged. "Just the way he looked at her." Detective Bennett asked him to explain. Tom leaned back, thinking. "Not like a normal customer," he said. More like he was trying to figure her out. Trying to figure her out. The words fit too neatly with the emerging theory. Mercer may have been watching Emily for days, maybe longer, learning her routine, waiting for the moment she left the diner alone. But another piece of the puzzle still didn't fit. Why Emily? Why that particular waitress in a roadside diner? The answer might have been random, or it might have been something far darker. Investigators began digging deeper into Mercer's history with women. The records told a troubling story. In 1994, 3 years after Emily's death, Mercer had been accused of assaulting a girlfriend during an argument. Police were called to the house. The woman claimed Mercer had grabbed her by the throat, strangled her briefly, then released her. The case never went to trial. The woman refused to testify, but the report remained, and it contained one chilling similarity: manual strangulation. The same method used in Emily Carter's murder. Detective Bennett felt the pieces tightening, but prosecutors still needed more. They needed something that placed Mercer at the diner the night Emily disappeared. Because after 30 years, a defense attorney could easily argue that DNA alone didn't prove murder. Perhaps Mercer had brushed past Emily earlier that week. Perhaps the hair transferred innocently. Investigators had to prove he was there that night. And the breakthrough came from a place no one expected. A photograph. Inside a dusty box of old diner memorabilia, a former employee had kept a stack of photographs taken during the early 1990s. Staff parties, holiday decorations, customers laughing in booths. Most were unremarkable, until Bennett noticed one image dated October 1991. The picture showed a group of employees standing near the counter. Emily Carter stood in the center, smiling at the camera. Behind her, in the background, sitting in a booth near the window, a man wearing a baseball cap, his face partially visible. Detective Bennett enlarged the image, enhanced it, compared the facial structure, the nose, the jawline, the spacing of the eyes. It was Daniel Mercer, sitting quietly in the diner days before Emily died, watching. The photograph didn't prove murder, but it proved something equally important. Mercer had been there, repeatedly, watching a woman who would later be found dead in the desert. The case that once seemed impossible was suddenly rebuilding itself piece by piece. Witnesses, DNA, a photograph placing the suspect inside the diner. But there was still one missing chapter in the story. What happened after Emily stepped into the parking lot? What happened during the dark drive out of town? Because somewhere between the diner and that lonely desert road, something violent unfolded inside Mercer's truck. Something desperate enough that Emily lost a shoe while trying to escape. Something brutal enough to leave bruises on her wrists and throat. And investigators believe the answers might still be inside Mercer's past. Because when they began examining his life after 1991, a disturbing pattern emerged. Small incidents, anger, violence toward women, always just below the level of major criminal charges, always slipping through the cracks, which raised a chilling question. Had Emily Carter truly been his only victim? Or had the desert simply hidden the rest better? Detectives pushed deeper into Mercer's history, following every address he had ever lived at, every job he had ever taken. And somewhere along that trail of forgotten towns and temporary jobs, they began to notice something unsettling. Another disappearance. Another woman. Another case that had never been solved. And suddenly the investigation was no longer just about a single cold case from 1991. It was about the possibility that Daniel Mercer had been carrying secrets far darker than anyone had imagined. Secrets buried across decades. Secrets that were now beginning to surface. The discovery of Daniel Mercer's DNA on Emily Carter's clothing had cracked open a door investigators believed would never move again. But as Detective Laura Bennett dug deeper into his past, the case began to feel less like a single crime and more like the shadow of something larger. Mercer's life after 1991 stretched across several states. Arizona,
Utah,
Colorado, small towns, temporary jobs, quiet neighborhoods where people tended not to ask questions. The pattern repeated itself again and again. Mercer would arrive, stay a few years, then move on. At first glance, the timeline looked ordinary. But when investigators began overlaying unsolved cases along the same geographic path, something unsettling started to emerge. Not a clear pattern. Not enough to charge him with anything else. But enough to make detectives pause. One of those cases came from 1996, 5 years after Emily Carter's murder. The town was small, barely 2,000 residents, sitting along a lonely stretch of highway in northern Arizona. The case file had been thin from the beginning. A 27-year-old woman named Rachel Donnelly had disappeared after leaving a roadside bar late one night. Her car was found in the parking lot the next morning. Locked.
Keys missing.
Almost the same detail investigators had seen in Emily's case. Rachel's body was never found. At the time, police suspected she had been picked up by someone passing through town. But with no witnesses and no physical evidence, the investigation stalled quickly. Eventually, the file had been labeled what so many others had become: unsolved. A cold case. Detective Bennett discovered something that made the connection impossible to ignore. In the spring of 1996, Daniel Mercer had been living less than 10 miles from that bar, working at a local construction site. The proximity alone didn't prove anything. People move through towns all the time without committing crimes. But for investigators already looking at Mercer through the lens of Emily Carter's murder, the coincidence felt heavier than chance. And Rachel Donnelly wasn't the only name that appeared along Mercer's path. There were others. A disturbing argument with a co-worker's wife in Utah. A police report in Colorado involving a roadside altercation with a female hitchhiker. None of the incidents led to serious charges. None of them directly connected Mercer to murder. But they painted a picture. A man with a temper. A man who seemed to develop sudden, intense conflicts with women. A man who rarely stayed in one place long enough for anyone to build a complete history of who he really was. Meanwhile, the investigation in Nevada continued building momentum. Detective Bennett had already secured the most critical piece of evidence. Mercer's DNA matched the hair recovered from Emily Carter's jacket. But prosecutors needed more. The case had to tell a clear story. Not just about who had been involved, but about what happened. So Bennett turned her attention back to the night of October 16, 1991. Forensic experts re-examined every piece of physical evidence stored from the original crime scene. Emily's clothing, the cloth used to bind her wrists, soil samples from the desert location. Technology had advanced dramatically since the early 90s, and modern analysis sometimes reveals details that earlier investigators simply couldn't detect. One discovery immediately stood out. Tiny particles embedded in the fibers of Emily's jacket. Metal shavings. Not the kind you'd find in a restaurant or parking lot, but the kind commonly produced in machine shops or automotive repair garages. At first glance, it seemed like a minor detail. But when investigators reviewed Mercer's employment history again, something clicked. In 1991, Mercer had been working part-time at a small mechanical repair yard near Interstate 15. The shop specialized in heavy truck maintenance, grinding metal, cutting steel, producing the exact type of shavings now found on Emily's clothing. The implication was subtle but powerful. Emily had been inside an environment like that shortly before her death. Or she had been in contact with someone who worked there. Someone like Daniel Mercer. The timeline tightened even further. And then another piece of evidence surfaced. Back in 1991, detectives had taken plaster casts of tire tracks found near the area where Emily's body was discovered. At the time, the tracks had been considered too generic to identify a specific vehicle. Pickup trucks with similar tires were everywhere across rural Nevada. But technology had changed. Digital analysis could now compare subtle wear patterns inside those tire impressions. The old casts were retrieved from storage and scanned. Investigators compared the digital reconstruction to historical records of Mercer's 1984 Ford F-150. Maintenance logs showed he had replaced the truck's tires only months before Emily's murder. The model of tire matched the general pattern seen in the desert impressions. Again, it wasn't perfect proof. But it was another thread tightening around Mercer. DNA. Witness statements, employment links, tire similarities, a photograph placing him inside the diner, and a documented history of violent behavior toward women. Piece by piece, the case that had once been frozen was beginning to move. Meanwhile, Mercer remained unaware that investigators had reopened the door to his past. Surveillance continued quietly. Detectives watched him move through his daily routine. He woke early, worked in his garage, drove to the grocery store once or twice a week, occasionally sat alone on his porch in the evenings. To anyone passing by, he looked like an ordinary older man living an unremarkable life. That was the part investigators found most unsettling. For 30 years, the man suspected of killing Emily Carter had blended into ordinary life without leaving visible cracks. Neighbors described him as quiet,
polite,
reserved. One woman who lived across the street said he sometimes helped carry her groceries. Another neighbor said Mercer kept himself, but never caused trouble. The normalcy was chilling, because detectives knew something those neighbors did not. Inside a locked evidence room hundreds of miles away, Mercer's DNA sat beside a photograph of Emily Carter, a young woman frozen forever at 22. Her life cut short on a desert road. The contrast between those two realities created a tension investigators could feel every day. But they also knew something else. Cold cases are fragile. If suspects learn they are being investigated, they can disappear again, destroy evidence, or worse. So the team moved carefully, building the strongest case possible before making their move. And as Detective Bennett continued reviewing Mercer's life, she discovered one more detail that made the investigation feel even darker. In the years immediately after Emily Carter's murder, Mercer had suddenly left Nevada. No explanation. No farewell to coworkers. Just packed up and moved. The timing was precise. Only weeks after police first interviewed him about Emily's disappearance. At the time, investigators had dismissed the move as coincidence. People relocated frequently for work in the early 90s. But now the timeline looked very different. It looked like someone leaving town before questions became too serious. Someone who believed distance would protect him. For 30 years, that belief had been correct.
But the world had changed.
Technology had changed. And the tiny strand of hair Mercer left behind on Emily Carter's jacket had waited patiently for science to catch up. Now the past was closing in. And investigators were finally ready to confront the man who might have believed he had escaped the desert forever. For 30 years, Daniel Mercer had lived inside a quiet routine that no one questioned. He woke early, drank coffee alone at the kitchen table, worked with his hands in the garage behind his house. Sometimes neighbors heard the grinding sound of metal tools long before sunrise. Other days the garage remained closed, Mercer disappearing inside for hours without explanation. To the people living around him, he was simply the quiet man at the end of the road. No one saw the ghost following him. But in Nevada, the investigation had entered its final phase. Detective Laura Bennett sat inside a conference room surrounded by the evidence that had slowly rebuilt itself over 3 decades. Photographs of Emily Carter, crime scene reports, DNA analysis, witness statements newly recorded from people who had not thought about that night since the early 1990s. And in the center of the table sat a printed image. Daniel Mercer, the man investigators now believed had been watching Emily inside the Silver Spur diner before she vanished into the night. The case file was no longer a collection of scattered clues.
It was a timeline.
October 16, 1991. Emily finishes her shift. A man sits quietly in a booth watching her. She walks into the parking lot. A dark pickup truck waits nearby. After that moment, the world loses her. But Mercer's life continued forward. He moved away from Nevada, changed towns, built a new identity as a quiet, private man. What investigators needed now was something that connected the final moments of Emily's life directly to Mercer's actions. And that connection might still exist somewhere in Mercer's past. Detective Bennett returned to the one place investigators had not examined deeply enough in 1991. Mercer's former workplace. the mechanical repair yard outside Mesquite. In the early 90s, the place had been a chaotic cluster of metal sheds and service bays where truck engines were dismantled, rebuilt, and welded back together. Sparks flew constantly from cutting torches. The air smelled of oil and hot steel. Perfect conditions for tiny metal shavings. The same type now discovered embedded in Emily Carter's jacket. The yard itself had changed ownership years earlier, but the original building still stood. A large corrugated steel structure with 3 garage doors and a dirt lot behind it. When Bennett stepped inside for the first time, she noticed something immediately. The interior layout had barely changed since 1991. Workbenches, grinding stations, the same heavy equipment that would have produced the exact metallic particles found in the forensic reanalysis. But what caught Bennett's attention most was the back area of the building. A narrow storage space hidden behind a row of shelves. It was isolated, out of view from the main work floor. The current owner explained that mechanics sometimes used it to store spare parts or work on small projects away from the noise. Bennett looked around slowly. The space was just large enough for a truck to back into, and just private enough that no one would easily see what was happening inside. The possibility formed instantly. If Mercer had taken Emily somewhere after leaving the diner, this location would have been perfect.
Close to the highway.
Familiar to him, and hidden from public view. There was no physical evidence remaining after 30 years. No blood. No fibers. Nothing the modern forensic team could recover. But the layout alone made the theory disturbingly plausible. Investigators returned to Mercer's old co-workers, searching for anyone who remembered his habits during that time. Most had moved away or passed on, but one man still lived nearby. His name was Gary Holt, a former mechanic who had worked the same shift as Mercer during the early 90s. Gary had not spoken with police since the original investigation. When Detective Bennett visited him, he seemed surprised anyone was still asking questions about that time. But as the conversation unfolded, one detail resurfaced. Mercer stayed late sometimes, Gary said. How late? Bennett asked. Gary shrugged. After everyone else left. Working alone at night. Inside a building large enough to hide a truck. The timeline suddenly became clearer. If Mercer left the diner with Emily sometime after 10:15 p.m., he could have driven to the repair yard in under 10 minutes. From there, the rest of the night remained hidden from witnesses. But investigators believed they understood what likely happened next. Emily may have realized something was wrong during the drive. The missing shoe suggested she tried to escape. Maybe she fought. Maybe she tried to run. The bruising on her wrists indicated restraint. And the medical examiner's report described signs of a violent struggle before the strangulation. A struggle that may have taken place inside Mercer's truck or somewhere even darker. The reconstruction of events was chilling, and it placed Mercer at the center of every moment. But before prosecutors could move forward, there was still one final step. They needed to confront him. The surveillance team had watched Daniel Mercer for nearly 2 weeks before the arrest was authorized. By that point, the case against him had grown stronger than anyone in the department had imagined when the genealogy search first began. DNA evidence connecting him to Emily Carter. Witnesses placing him inside the diner. A photograph confirming his presence days before the murder. Employment ties to the metal particles found on Emily's clothing. And a truck matching the vehicle seen leaving the parking lot that night. The case was no longer a fragile theory. It was a narrative prosecutors believed a jury could understand. But arresting someone for a 30-year-old murder requires precision. The warrant was prepared carefully. Evidence reviewed again and again. Every detail checked. Because once Mercer was taken into custody, the story that had slept for 3 decades would explode into the open. Early one morning, just before sunrise, investigators gathered quietly near Mercer Street. The town was still asleep. Streetlights hummed softly above empty sidewalks. A cold wind moved through the trees. Inside his house, Mercer's kitchen light flicked on around 5:30 a.m. Just like every other morning, he poured coffee, sat at the same table where he had begun thousands of ordinary days. Outside, unmarked vehicles waited. Detective Bennett watched from the passenger seat of one of the cars. After months of investigation and decades of unanswered questions, the moment had finally arrived. At 6:02 a.m., Mercer stepped outside his house. He walked toward the pickup truck parked in the driveway. The same routine neighbors had seen countless times. He opened the driver's door. And at that moment, the quiet streets suddenly filled with movement. Police vehicles rolled forward, lights flashing. Officers stepped out quickly. Daniel Mercer. The shout cut through the morning air. Mercer froze. For a moment, he simply stood beside the truck, looking confused. Then he slowly raised his hands. The arrest itself lasted less than 30 seconds. But the weight of that moment stretched across 3 decades. Handcuffs clicked shut around Mercer's wrists. And just like that, the man who had once quietly walked out of a diner parking lot with Emily Carter was no longer invisible. He was placed in the back of a patrol vehicle. As detectives approached, Mercer looked strangely calm, almost curious. Detective Bennett introduced herself. Then she said the words Mercer had not heard in 30 years. Daniel Mercer, you are under arrest for the murder of Emily Carter. For the first time since officers arrived, something changed in his expression. A brief flicker. Recognition. Memory. But the moment passed quickly. Mercer said nothing. No denial. No explanation. Just silence. The ride to the station lasted less than an hour. Inside the interrogation room, the past finally caught up with him. Detectives placed a photograph on the table. Emily Carter. Smiling. 22 years old. Mercer stared at the picture for a long time. And then the questioning began. For 30 years, the desert had kept its secret. Now investigators were about to find out whether the man sitting across from them would finally speak. Or whether the truth behind Emily Carter's final night would remain locked inside the silence of the man accused of taking her life. The interrogation room was small, windowless, and quiet in a way that made every movement sound louder than it should. Daniel Mercer sat on one side of the metal table, his hands cuffed in front of him. The fluorescent lights above cast a pale glow across his face, flattening every expression. For a man who had just been arrested for a murder that happened 30 years earlier, he looked strangely calm. Detective Laura Bennett sat across from him. Between them lay a thin stack of photographs. At the top was Emily Carter, 22 years old, frozen forever in the kind of bright, careless smile that belonged to someone who still believed tomorrow would come exactly as planned. Mercer stared at the photograph for several seconds before looking away. Bennett didn't speak immediately. Silence can be a powerful tool in interrogation, especially when the suspect doesn't yet understand how much investigators know. Finally, she slid another photograph across the table. A grainy enlargement from the diner picture investigators had recovered. The booth by the window. A man wearing a baseball cap. Mercer again. 30 years younger. Watching. Mercer looked down at the image, his eyes narrowing slightly. Recognize that place? Bennett asked. No response. His gaze shifted toward the wall. Bennett waited. Then she spoke again. That's the Silver Spur Diner. Mesquite, Nevada. October 1991. Still nothing. Some suspects talk quickly once confronted with evidence. Others retreat into silence, hoping investigators don't have enough to push further. Mercer appeared to be the second type. So Bennett moved to the next step. She placed a third photograph on the table. This one wasn't from the diner. It was the desert road where Emily Carter had been found. Dusty brush. A rusted fence line. The lonely stretch of gravel where her life had ended. Mercer's eyes flicked toward the image, then back down to the table. You told detectives you were home that night, Bennett said calmly. That's what you said in 1991. No reaction. But you weren't home, Daniel. She slid another document across the table. The DNA report. Your DNA was found on Emily Carter's jacket. That sentence finally broke the stillness. Mercer looked up. Not shocked. Not angry. Just alert. People often imagine that suspects collapse when confronted with DNA evidence. But experienced investigators know that isn't always how it works. Some suspects attempt to reinterpret the evidence. Others simply wait, hoping investigators are bluffing. Mercer leaned back slightly in his chair. "How's that possible?" he asked. His voice was steady. It was the first time he had spoken since the arrest. Bennett met his eyes. "You tell me." Mercer exhaled slowly. "I might have been in that diner," he said. "Long time ago." The statement was cautious, carefully worded. An admission of presence, but nothing more. Bennett nodded slightly.
"You were there a lot," she said.
Then she placed another item on the table, a printout of the forensic genealogy analysis. "You left a hair on her jacket," Bennett continued. "It sat in an evidence box for nearly 30 years. Mercer's expression hardened slightly. "And now it's talking." Silence again filled the room. Bennett decided to push further. "You watched her," she said quietly. "Several nights." Mercer didn't answer. "You sat in that booth by the window," Bennett continued. "Drank coffee. Waited until her shift ended. Still nothing. You followed her into the parking lot." Mercer's jaw tightened. "And then you drove away together." For the first time, Mercer shook his head. That didn't happen. The denial came quickly, almost reflexively. Bennett leaned forward slightly. "We know you owned a dark Ford pickup," she said. "Witnesses saw that truck leaving the diner with a woman inside." Mercer's eyes moved again, calculating. "Could have been anybody," he replied. "That was 30 years ago." Bennett slid the final photograph across the table. Emily's white sneaker, recovered half a mile from where her body was found. "She lost this trying to run," Bennett said. Mercer didn't look at the image. Instead, he stared at the metal surface of the table. "People say a lot of things after 30 years, he muttered. Bennett studied him carefully. She had seen this type before. Not a man who panicked. Not someone prone to sudden confession. Mercer was trying to shrink the case into uncertainty, into doubt. And that was exactly what defense attorneys would attempt in court. But Bennett had something Mercer didn't know. Another piece of the puzzle. Another witness. Someone who had not come forward in 1991. Someone who had only recently realized the memory they carried might be important. Bennett opened a folder slowly. Inside was a statement taken just 3 weeks earlier. A man named Kevin Rollins. In 1991, Kevin had been a 17-year-old gas station attendant working the night shift along Interstate 15. For decades, he had never connected what he saw that night to Emily Carter's murder. But when news reports about the reopened investigation began circulating, something triggered his memory. A dark pickup truck speeding down the highway shortly after midnight. A truck matching the description of Mercer's old Ford. And inside the passenger seat, a woman. Kevin remembered something else too. The passenger door had opened briefly while the truck slowed near the shoulder, as if someone inside had tried to escape. Bennett slid the witness statement across the table. Mercer read the first few lines, then stopped. "This kid's guessing," he said quietly. "Maybe." Bennett leaned back. "But his guess lines up with everything else." Mercer didn't respond. The room returned to silence. After several seconds, Bennett spoke again. "You left Nevada right after we interviewed you," she said. Mercer's eyes flicked upward again. "People move." "You left 2 weeks after the murder." No answer. "You never came back." Mercer looked toward the door, then back at the table. Finally, he said something unexpected. "You can't prove what happened that night." It wasn't a denial. It wasn't an admission. It was a challenge. And Bennett understood exactly what it meant. Mercer knew investigators had built a powerful case. But he also knew something else. 30 years had passed. Evidence fades. Memories weaken. And if he refused to speak, the story of Emily Carter's final hours might remain incomplete forever. But Mercer underestimated one thing. The investigation wasn't finished yet. Because while detectives had been digging into Mercer's past, they had uncovered one final piece of evidence, something buried in storage for decades. Something no one had connected to Mercer until now. And when that final detail surfaced, the fragile wall of silence Mercer had built around himself began to crack. Because the desert had not erased everything from that night. One small fragment of truth had survived, waiting patiently for someone to find it. And now that fragment was about to change everything investigators thought they knew about Emily Carter's final moments. Daniel Mercer believed he understood the rules of silence. For 3 decades, that silence had protected him. Investigators had come and gone. Witnesses had forgotten details. The desert had erased tracks and buried evidence beneath years of wind and sun. Time, Mercer assumed, was on his side. Now he sat inside an interrogation room staring at a stack of photographs and forensic reports that had survived those 30 years with remarkable patience. But he also knew something else. Investigators still didn't have the entire story. And if he never told it, maybe they never would. Detective Laura Bennett watched him carefully. Mercer had spoken just enough to confirm one thing. He wasn't surprised to be connected to Emily Carter. The moment he heard about the DNA evidence, something in his posture changed. Not panic, recognition. Like a man hearing a sound from the past that he always knew might return. But Mercer also understood the limits of what investigators could prove. And that was why he remained silent. So Bennett changed tactics. Instead of asking questions, she reached into a folder and removed a small plastic evidence bag. Inside was something Mercer had never expected to see again. A strip of faded cloth. The same cloth used to bind Emily Carter's wrists. It had been preserved since 1991.
Stored.
Cataloged. Almost forgotten. Until forensic specialists re-examined it during the reopened investigation. Bennett placed the bag gently on the table. Mercer's eyes moved toward it almost immediately.
He recognized it.
The reaction was subtle, a tightening of the jaw, a slight shift in his shoulders. But it was there. Bennett noticed. "Remember this?" she asked quietly. Mercer didn't answer. But his gaze didn't move away from the evidence bag. Back in 1991, investigators had treated the cloth as a simple restraint, something torn from clothing during the attack. But modern forensic analysis had revealed something new. Microscopic fibers embedded within the fabric. Fibers that did not belong to Emily Carter. Fibers that matched the material used in a specific type of mechanics work shirt commonly issued at repair yards during the early 1990s. The exact type of uniform Mercer had worn at the truck maintenance shop outside Mesquite. But the most important discovery wasn't the fibers. It was what investigators found stitched into the corner of the cloth. A partial laundry mark. 2 faded letters.
Me.
At the time, the marking had meant nothing. Now it meant something very specific. Mercer Enterprises. The name printed on the industrial uniforms worn by employees at the repair yard where Daniel Mercer worked. Bennett slid a photograph of the marking across the table. Mercer stared at it for a long time. "This came from your work shirt," Bennett said calmly. Mercer finally leaned back in his chair. He rubbed his hands together slowly, the metal cuffs clicking softly against each other. "You're guessing," he said. But the confidence in his voice had faded slightly. Because the evidence was no longer abstract. It was personal. Something connected directly to his daily life in 1991. Something he could not easily dismiss as coincidence. Bennett watched him closely. "You followed her for days," she said. "Watched her inside the diner." Mercer shook his head faintly. But he still didn't look at her. "You waited until she finished work," Bennett continued. "You talked to her in the parking lot." The silence stretched longer now. Mercer's breathing had slowed. Not calm, controlled. Like someone trying to think carefully through a collapsing situation. "You offered her a ride," Bennett said.
No.
The word came quickly. Too quickly. The first firm denial Mercer had given. Bennett noted it immediately. "She didn't get into your truck willingly," she continued. No response. "You drove her away anyway." Mercer's eyes finally lifted. There was something different in them now. Something darker. "You don't know that," he said quietly. The sentence carried weight. Because it wasn't a denial. It was a challenge. And Bennett understood exactly what he meant. He was right about one thing. Investigators could reconstruct much of the night. But the exact moment Emily Carter entered his truck, that moment existed only in Mercer's memory. Unless Mercer spoke, that piece of the story might remain uncertain forever. But Bennett also knew something Mercer didn't. Investigators had uncovered another witness. Someone who had not been interviewed in 1991. Someone who had been just a child at the time. A boy living in a trailer park outside Mesquite. Now, 30 years later, that boy was a man. And he remembered something that had haunted him for decades. Bennett pulled out another document. A recent statement taken during the reopened investigation. The witness described waking late one night in October 1991, hearing a truck engine outside, then hearing something else. A woman screaming. The sound lasted only a few seconds before the truck drove away. The location? The trailer park where Daniel Mercer had lived. The same trailer park investigators now knew sat only minutes from the Silver Spur Diner. Bennett slid the statement across the table. Mercer read it slowly. The room felt heavier now. For the first time since the interrogation began, Mercer looked tired. Older. The weight of 30 years pressing against the quiet room. "You're building a story," he said quietly. Bennett nodded. "Yes." Mercer exhaled slowly. "But stories aren't proof." The sentence echoed inside the small room. And he was right. Stories alone were not proof. But the evidence surrounding that story had grown stronger with every new discovery. DNA, witnesses, employment records, photographs, fibers, all pointing in the same direction, all pointing toward Daniel Mercer, the man who had once quietly sat inside a diner booth watching Emily Carter serve coffee, the man now sitting across from detectives 30 years later. Mercer looked down at the photograph of Emily again, the same smiling picture that had opened the interrogation. For a moment, his expression changed. Something flickered there. Regret. Or memory. Maybe both. But it passed quickly. Mercer leaned back again and closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his voice was calm. "I want a lawyer." The interrogation stopped immediately. Detectives gathered their files. The door opened. Mercer was escorted out of the room. And just like that, the man who might know exactly what happened during Emily Carter's final hours had sealed his silence once again. But outside that room, the case was already moving forward, because prosecutors believed they now had enough to bring Daniel Mercer to trial. And when the story of October 16, 1991 finally reached a courtroom, the quiet secret Mercer had carried for 3 decades would be told piece by piece, even if he never spoke another word. But there was still one final chapter left in the story. A chapter written not in interrogation rooms or evidence reports, but in the long shadow that Emily Carter's murder had cast over the small Nevada community where it began. Because for the people who had lived with that mystery for 30 years, the truth was about to return home. And when it did, the silence surrounding that desert road would finally begin to break. When the news finally reached Mesquite, Nevada, it moved through the town the way desert storms do, sudden, heavy, impossible to ignore. For years, Emily Carter's name had existed there like a quiet echo. People remembered the story, but it had softened with time. The Silver Spur Diner was long gone. The neon lights had been removed. New businesses had opened along the highway. But some memories never really leave a place. Older residents still remembered the week Emily disappeared. They remembered the police cars, the reporters standing outside the diner with cameras and microphones, the uneasy feeling that something violent had slipped into their quiet town and then vanished again into the desert. For 30 years, that feeling had remained unresolved. Until now, the arrest of Daniel Mercer forced the entire story back into the light. Local news stations replayed the details again and again. The diner, the dark pickup truck, the lonely service road where Emily Carter had been found lying in the weeds beside a rusted fence line. And the most shocking detail of all, the man now accused of killing her had been identified not by a witness or confession, but by a single strand of DNA preserved for 3 decades. For Emily's family, the news felt unreal. Her parents had grown old waiting for answers. Friends who once studied with her in college were now raising families of their own. Some had spent years believing the case would remain unsolved forever. But now a name had finally been placed beside the crime. Daniel Mercer, the quiet mechanic who had once lived just minutes away from the diner where Emily worked. The man investigators believed had been watching her in the days before she died. The man whose DNA had survived inside an evidence box long enough for science to catch up. For detectives who had spent years working cold cases, the moment carried a complicated weight. Victory didn't feel the way people imagined it would. There was no sudden sense of celebration. Because even with Mercer in custody, the most important question remained unanswered. What exactly happened during Emily Carter's final hours? Mercer had chosen silence.
No confession.
No explanation. And without those words, investigators could only reconstruct the night through evidence and inference. The likely sequence was painfully clear. Emily left the diner shortly after 10:13 p.m. Mercer approached her in the parking lot. Perhaps he offered help. Perhaps he forced the situation. At some point, she ended up inside his truck. The drive away from town happened quickly. Witnesses later recalled seeing a dark pickup heading down the highway after midnight. Somewhere along that drive, Emily realized she was in danger. The lost shoe suggested she tried to escape. Maybe the truck slowed. Maybe the door opened. But she didn't get away. At some point, Mercer restrained her using cloth torn from his work shirt. And later, in the silence of the Nevada desert, the struggle ended with his hands around her throat. That final moment, the moment when Emily Carter's life ended, exists only in Mercer's memory. A memory he may never share. But even without his confession, the case had done something remarkable. It had proved that time does not erase every crime. For decades, Mercer believed the desert had protected him. The wind erased tire tracks. Witnesses forgot faces. Evidence sat quietly in storage rooms collecting dust. But the smallest fragment of the past survived. A single hair, invisible to the naked eye, waiting patiently for a future that did not exist in 1991. And when that future finally arrived, it spoke. The technology that exposed Mercer's identity had changed the entire world of criminal investigation. Genetic genealogy. Family trees built from strangers' DNA. The idea that a killer might be discovered not through his own actions, but through the curiosity of distant relatives submitting ancestry tests. It was a concept almost unimaginable when Emily Carter walked out of the Silver Spur diner 30 years earlier. But it had finally brought investigators back to the truth. In the months after Mercer's arrest, the desert road where Emily had been found began attracting quiet visitors again. People left flowers near the fence line. Some left handwritten notes. Most stayed only a few minutes. The place itself hadn't changed much. Dry winds still moved across the brush. The highway still hummed faintly in the distance. But the silence felt different now. Not empty. Answered. For Detective Laura Bennett, the case would always remain unfinished in one important way. She had spent years studying the evidence, reconstructing every possible moment of that night. But the final piece, the human explanation behind Mercer's actions, remained locked away inside the mind of the man who refused to speak. Maybe it was anger, maybe obsession, maybe something darker that investigators would never fully understand. Cold cases rarely end with perfect clarity. Sometimes they end with something quieter.
A name. An arrest.
A truth recovered just enough to remind the world that even the oldest mysteries are not truly gone. And somewhere in Nevada, beneath the endless desert sky, the memory of Emily Carter no longer exists only as a question. It exists as a story that waited 30 years to be heard. A story carried inside a single strand of hair. A story that refused to disappear.
Viết tiếp giúp tôi phần 12.
Nevada 1990 One Cold Case Breakthrough. Routine Genealogy Test Unmasks Suspect. Part 12. For most people in Mesquite, the story should have ended with the arrest. A suspect identified. Evidence assembled. A murder that had haunted the town for 3 decades finally pulled back into the light. But the truth about long-buried crimes is rarely that simple. Because once investigators reopened the past, they began noticing something unsettling, something that extended beyond Emily Carter's case. Daniel Mercer's life had stretched across multiple states, dozens of small towns, and nearly 40 years of quiet movement from place to place. For decades, he had drifted along highways that cut through isolated communities where strangers passed through without leaving much trace. And now detectives were asking a difficult question. What if Emily Carter had not been the only one? The question surfaced first inside a meeting room at the Clark County Sheriff's Office. Detectives had gathered to review the full timeline of Mercer's life, every job, every address, every documented incident stretching back to the late 1980s. Pinned across the wall were maps. Nevada, Arizona,
Utah,
Colorado. Small markers indicated the places Mercer had lived. But as investigators compared those locations against historical police records, other markers began appearing. Unsolved disappearances, missing persons reports, violent assaults that never reached trial. Most of the cases had been dismissed years earlier because investigators had no suspects, no physical evidence, no reason to connect them to anything larger. But Mercer's arrest changed that perspective. Suddenly, detectives were looking at the past with new eyes. One case in particular stood out. It came from northern Arizona in the mid-1990s. The victim was a woman named Rachel Donnelly, 27 years old, when she vanished after leaving a roadside bar late one night. Her car was found parked exactly where she had left it. Locked.
Keys gone.
At the time, investigators suspected she had accepted a ride from someone she believed she could trust. The case never moved forward. Rachel's body was never found. But when detectives compared the timeline, they discovered something impossible to ignore. In the spring of that same year, Daniel Mercer had been living less than 10 miles away, working construction on a highway expansion project. The connection didn't prove anything, but it was enough for investigators in Arizona to reopen the file. Suddenly, a murder case in Nevada was rippling outward across state lines. The past was beginning to shift. Meanwhile, back in Mesquite, people were still trying to process the reality that someone they had once passed on the street might have been responsible for the town's most haunting crime. Some remembered Mercer vaguely. A quiet man with a pickup truck. A mechanic who kept to himself. Others had no memory of him at all. That was perhaps the most disturbing detail. For 30 years, Mercer had lived invisibly inside ordinary life. He wasn't a drifter sleeping under bridges. He wasn't a fugitive constantly running from the law. He was simply a man who blended into the background. And that ability to disappear into routine had allowed him to carry the secret of Emily Carter's death across decades. But while Mercer remained silent, the evidence surrounding him continued growing stronger. Prosecutors built the case methodically. The DNA connection. The diner photograph. Witness statements placing Mercer in the area that night. Fibers from the cloth binding matching his work uniform. Each piece alone might have been challenged in court. Together they formed something powerful. A story that jurors could understand. The story of a young woman who finished her shift at a roadside diner and stepped into the darkness outside. And the story of the man investigators believed was waiting for her there. For Emily Carter's family, the approaching trial felt like reopening a wound that had never fully healed. For decades they had lived with uncertainty, the endless questions that accompany unsolved crimes. Now they were preparing to hear every detail again. The night she disappeared. The condition of the crime scene. The evidence collected from her clothing. All of it would be presented publicly in a courtroom. Sometimes justice requires revisiting the most painful moments of the past. But the family also knew something important. Without that painful process, the truth might remain buried forever. Detective Laura Bennett understood that better than anyone. Cold cases have a way of reshaping the lives of the investigators who work them. When Bennett first opened Emily Carter's file, she had seen only an old mystery. A stack of reports from a crime scene that no longer seemed connected to the present. But the deeper she dug, the more the case felt alive. Waiting. And now, standing at the edge of the trial that would finally confront Daniel Mercer with the weight of his past, Bennett felt something close to resolution. Not satisfaction. Because nothing could return Emily Carter to the people who loved her. But something quieter. A sense that the truth, however incomplete, had finally found its way back to the surface. Yet even as the courtroom preparations moved forward, investigators across multiple states continued reviewing Mercer's history. Because if there were other victims hidden along the highways he once traveled, their stories might still be waiting to emerge. And somewhere in the long trail of towns Mercer passed through, another forgotten case file might contain the next clue. Another witness. Another piece of evidence overlooked decades ago. The desert had kept its secrets for a very long time. But one cold case had already proven something powerful. Time does not protect the truth forever. Sometimes it only delays the moment when that truth finally returns. And when it does, it arrives carrying the weight of every year it spent buried. For Daniel Mercer, that moment had finally come. But for investigators still searching through the shadows of his past, the story might not be over yet. The courtroom was quieter than most people expected. No shouting. No dramatic confrontations. Just the steady rhythm of legal procedure slowly bringing a 30-year-old crime back into the present. Daniel Mercer sat at the defense table in a dark suit that didn't quite fit his aging frame. His hair, now mostly gray, was combed neatly. From a distance, he looked like any other man wading through a long day of court hearings. But everyone in that room knew why he was there. Across the aisle, Emily Carter's family sat together in silence. They held photographs. Not crime scene images. Not evidence. Just ordinary pictures from the life Emily once lived. Birthday parties, college days, a photograph taken outside the diner where she had worked part-time while finishing school. Those photographs reminded the courtroom of something important. Before Emily Carter became a case file, she had been a person.
A daughter.
A friend. A young woman planning a future she never had the chance to reach. The trial began with something simple. The timeline. Prosecutors walked the jury through October 16, 1991, step by step. The Silver Spur Diner. Emily finishing her shift. The man in the booth near the window. Witnesses describing a dark pickup truck waiting in the parking lot. For jurors who had never heard the story before, the details unfolded slowly, building a picture of that quiet Nevada night. Then came the photograph. The same image investigators had discovered years later inside a box of old diner memorabilia. Emily standing near the counter, smiling toward the camera. Behind her, slightly out of focus but unmistakable, sat Daniel Mercer. Watching. The courtroom fell silent as the image appeared on the large display screen. Prosecutors didn't need to say much. The photograph spoke for itself. Next came the forensic evidence. Experts explained how a single strand of hair had been recovered from Emily's jacket in 1991 and preserved inside an evidence bag. At the time, the technology to analyze that hair didn't exist. But decades later, genetic genealogy changed everything. Laboratory specialists described the process step by step, how DNA fragments were extracted from the aging sample, how they were compared against genealogical databases, how distant relatives eventually led investigators toward Mercer's family line. The science sounded almost unbelievable. A crime from 1991 solved not by a witness or confession, but by family connections hidden inside public DNA databases. Then came the final confirmation. Mercer's discarded water bottle. His DNA. The match. For many jurors, that moment carried the most weight. Because DNA doesn't rely on memory. It doesn't fade with time. It simply waits. But the most powerful testimony came from people whose lives had intersected briefly with that night long ago. Frank Delaney, the truck driver who remembered seeing Emily near the pickup truck. Tom Alvarez, the diner cook who recalled the quiet man watching her across multiple nights. Kevin Rollins, the former gas station clerk who described the truck speeding down the highway after midnight. Individually, their memories might have seemed uncertain. Together, they created a pattern pointing toward the same man sitting silently at the defense table. Throughout the trial, Mercer remained almost motionless. He listened, occasionally whispered to his attorney, but he never reacted strongly. No visible anger, no visible regret. Just the same quiet expression investigators had seen during the interrogation months earlier. The defense strategy was exactly what detectives expected.
Doubt.
30 years had passed. Memories were unreliable. Witnesses might be mistaken. Perhaps Mercer had been in the diner earlier that week. Perhaps the DNA transfer had been accidental. The defense didn't need to prove Mercer's innocence. They only needed to suggest that the story prosecutors told might be incomplete. But then came the final piece of evidence: the cloth used to bind Emily Carter's wrists. For decades, it had been stored as a simple piece of fabric. But modern analysis revealed something investigators had never noticed in 1991: the partial laundry marking. 2 faded letters.
Me.
Experts explained how industrial uniforms used by mechanics often carried those markings so they could be returned to the correct employee after cleaning. The same type of uniforms issued at the repair yard where Mercer worked. The connection was small, subtle, but devastating in its implication, because it placed something from Mercer's world directly at the center of the crime. As the trial continued, the courtroom atmosphere shifted slowly. The jurors listened carefully. The story of Emily Carter's final night grew clearer with every witness. And outside the courthouse, reporters waited for updates, knowing that a case buried for 3 decades was finally approaching its conclusion. But for many people following the trial, one detail remained hauntingly unresolved. Daniel Mercer had still not spoken.
No confession.
No explanation. Even as the evidence surrounding him grew heavier, he remained silent. Perhaps he believed silence still protected him. Perhaps the truth of that night belonged only to him. But the justice system does not always require confession. Sometimes the evidence tells the story instead. And by the time the prosecution finished presenting its case, that story had become difficult to ignore. A young woman leaving work late at night. A man watching her from a booth near the window. A truck leaving the parking lot. A desert road where the struggle ended. And a single strand of hair that waited 30 years to reveal the name of the man who left it behind. The trial moved closer to its final chapter. Soon the jury would step into a quiet room to decide whether the story they had heard proved something beyond doubt. Whether the man who had spent decades living quietly across state lines would now face the consequences of a crime committed long ago. For Emily Carter's family, the moment felt almost unreal. 30 years of waiting had led to this room, this trial, this final chance for the truth to be recognized. And outside the courthouse, the Nevada desert stretched endlessly toward the horizon, the same silent landscape that had once hidden the mystery of Emily Carter's death. A landscape that had kept its secret for decades, until the past finally returned to claim it. By the time the trial reached its final days, the courtroom carried a strange tension, the kind that settles in when a story decades in the making approaches its end. The jurors had heard weeks of testimony, witnesses who reached back through fading memories, forensic scientists explaining technology that did not even exist when the crime occurred, detectives describing how a single strand of hair had traveled through 30 years of evidence storage before finally revealing the name of the man now sitting quietly at the defense table. And still, through all of it, Daniel Mercer had remained silent.
No testimony.
No emotional reaction. Just a man sitting with folded hands while the past unfolded around him piece by piece. For Emily Carter's family, every hour inside that courtroom felt heavy. They had waited 3 decades for this moment, yet hearing the details of that night spoken aloud carried its own kind of pain. Because every witness added another layer to the story of Emily's final hours. And with each detail, the image of that night became harder to bear. The prosecution's closing argument came first. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury and did something simple. He told the story again. Not dramatically. Not with anger. Just clearly. October 16, 1991. A 22-year-old waitress finishing her shift at a small roadside diner. A man sitting quietly in a booth watching her. A truck waiting in the parking lot. A woman who never made it home. Then he turned to the evidence. The photograph placing Mercer inside the diner. Witnesses describing the truck. The cloth binding Emily's wrists. The fibers connecting that cloth to Mercer's work uniform. And finally, the DNA evidence, the tiny strand of hair that had remained silent for decades until science caught up. The prosecutor paused before speaking his final words. Time, he said slowly, does not erase the truth. It only hides it for a while. The defense attorney stood next. His argument followed a familiar strategy.
Doubt.
Memory fades. Witnesses misremember. Evidence collected 30 years earlier might not tell the full story. The defense reminded jurors that Mercer had never confessed, that no one had seen the exact moment Emily Carter entered his truck, that the events of that night remained incomplete. And then he said something that lingered in the room long after he finished speaking. 30 years ago, he said quietly, someone committed a terrible crime. But the question you must answer is not whether a crime happened. The question is whether the state has proven beyond doubt that Daniel Mercer was the one who committed it. The courtroom fell silent again. The judge turned toward the jury. Instructions were read slowly.
Carefully.
Every word mattered. Then the jurors stood. 12 strangers who had spent weeks listening to the fragments of a story that began long before some of them were even born. They walked through a door at the side of the courtroom. The door closed behind them. And just like that, the room that had held so much tension suddenly felt empty. Waiting. Hours passed. No one spoke much. Emily Carter's family remained seated together. Detectives who had worked the case sat quietly behind them. Even Daniel Mercer seemed unchanged, sitting beside his attorney with the same unreadable expression he had carried since the beginning of the trial. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited in the desert heat. The case had drawn national attention, not only because of the crime itself, but because of the extraordinary path investigators had taken to solve it. A cold case from 1991 reopened by modern DNA technology. A murder uncovered through genetic genealogy. The kind of breakthrough that had begun rewriting the rules of criminal investigation across the country. But inside the courthouse, the moment felt much more personal. This wasn't about technology. It was about a young woman whose life had ended on a lonely road outside town, and the long silence that followed. Late in the afternoon, the courtroom door opened. A court officer stepped inside. The jury has reached a verdict. Everyone stood. The jurors filed back into their seats. Some looked tired. Others avoided eye contact with anyone in the room. The judge asked the foreperson to stand. A folded sheet of paper was handed to the clerk. The clerk opened it carefully, and then read the words that would finally close a chapter that began more than 30 years earlier. The verdict echoed across the silent room. For the first time since 1991, the mystery surrounding Emily Carter's death had been answered in a court of law. But even as the words settled into the air, one truth remained unchanged. The man who knew exactly what happened on that desert road had never spoken. Not during the investigation. Not during the trial. Not even in the moment when the verdict sealed his fate. Somewhere inside his memory, the final minutes of Emily Carter's life remained locked away. And perhaps they always would. Outside the courthouse, the Nevada skies stretched endlessly over the same desert landscape that had once hidden the crime. The wind still moved through the brush. The highway still carried travelers across the empty miles. But the silence that had surrounded Emily Carter's case for 3 decades was finally gone. In its place remained a story. A story that proved something powerful. Even the oldest cold cases can return. Even the smallest piece of evidence can speak. And sometimes the truth waits patiently for years, even decades, until someone is finally ready to hear it. Long after the courtroom emptied, the story of Emily Carter refused to fade quietly. Trials end. Verdicts are recorded. Files are closed. But the echoes of certain cases linger in ways that statistics and legal documents cannot capture. For the people of Mesquite, Nevada, the memory of that October night in 1991 had lived in the background of everyday life for decades. It was the kind of story that resurfaced in quiet conversations. The waitress who vanished after work, the body found in the desert, the mystery no one could explain. For years, that mystery had felt permanent. Now it had a name attached to it. Daniel Mercer, the quiet mechanic who once lived just minutes from the diner where Emily Carter poured coffee for late-night customers. The man who had spent 3 decades living ordinary days, while the truth of that night remained buried inside a sealed evidence box. But even with the verdict delivered, investigators knew something important. Cases like this never truly end with a courtroom decision. They ripple outward. They change the way detectives work. They alter how communities remember the past. And sometimes they reopen questions no one had thought to ask before. In the months following the trial, law enforcement agencies across several states quietly began reviewing old case files connected to places Mercer had once lived. Arizona,
Utah,
Colorado. Small towns scattered along the highways where Mercer had spent years moving between jobs. Most of those files would likely remain exactly what they had always been, unsolved mysteries with no clear suspect. But investigators had learned something powerful from Emily Carter's case. The past can change when technology catches up. DNA that meant nothing in 1991 could suddenly become the key to an entire investigation decades later. And somewhere inside evidence rooms across the country, other forgotten samples might still be waiting. Hair fragments, fibers, biological traces collected during investigations that once reached dead ends. Evidence preserved not because detectives expected future breakthroughs, but simply because they refused to throw away the possibility of truth. Emily Carter's case became one of the examples investigators pointed to when explaining the power of genetic genealogy. A single strand of hair. No suspect.
No confession.
30 years of silence. And then a quiet chain reaction triggered by something completely unrelated to crime. A distant relative submitting a DNA sample to learn about their family ancestry. That one moment had unknowingly pointed investigators toward the man who left the hair behind. For Detective Laura Bennett, the case carried a deeper meaning. Cold cases can consume investigators slowly. They involve reading the same reports again and again, studying photographs that never change, chasing leads that have already faded. But occasionally, one of those files breaks open. And when it does, the effect reaches far beyond a single investigation. The Carter case reminded everyone inside the department that patience matters. Evidence matters. Even when it sits untouched for decades. One afternoon several weeks after the trial ended, Bennett drove out to the same desert road where Emily Carter's body had been discovered in 1991. The place looked almost exactly the same. The rusted fence still leaned slightly toward the gravel road. Dry brush moved gently in the wind. The highway hummed faintly somewhere beyond the hills. It was easy to imagine how the scene must have looked that morning when the maintenance worker first noticed something lying in the weeds. Easy to imagine how quiet it must have been before the flashing lights of police cars arrived. Bennett stood there for a while, without speaking. Investigators rarely visit old crime scenes after cases are closed. But this one felt different. Because for 30 years, this stretch of desert had held a question. Now it held an answer. Not a perfect answer. Not a complete explanation of every moment that happened that night. But enough truth to change the story forever. Someone had taken Emily Carter's life on that road. For decades, the identity of that person remained hidden. Now it was no longer hidden. The wind moved through the brush again. And for the first time in 30 years, the silence there felt lighter. Not because the past had been erased, but because it had finally been heard. Somewhere far away, inside a prison cell, Daniel Mercer continued living the quiet life he had always preferred. Still silent. Still keeping the final details of that night locked inside his own memory. Perhaps he would never speak. Perhaps the exact sequence of Emily Carter's last moments would remain incomplete forever. But the truth no longer belonged only to him. It belonged to the evidence. To the investigators who refused to give up. To the science that arrived decades too late, and yet just in time. And to the memory of a young woman whose story waited patiently through 30 years of darkness until the smallest fragment of DNA finally spoke her name back into the world. Because some stories don't disappear. They wait, quietly, until the moment the truth is ready to return.